I, Dr. James Wesley, place this testimony here as a record of the events leading up to the death. Note the destruction of everybody that worked at the corporate offices of Osset Pharmaceutical found in Washington State. We were told that the work we were doing was going to help people. This started last spring. I got a call from the headmaster at Carbuncle Academy. I had been studying medicine there for nearly 3 years and never once been asked to his office, so the thought of being summoned actually terrified me. Marsh was old as dirt and as stern as a brick wall. He smoked a pipe and wore clothes that looked like they belonged in the 1930s. As I entered his office, he placed a vinyl record on an old player and let classical music fill the air. He told me to close the door and asked me if I was familiar with the piece, to which I admitted that I wasn't. According to him, the music was created by a local cult leader back in the 1880s named Abraham Zwain. The headmaster explained that Zwain had managed to convince hundreds in the area to kill themselves due to a meteor shower. If I might ask, why are you telling me this, sir? His bizarre ramblings about ritualistic genocide had left me unnerved, and I wasn't entirely sure what the purpose was of my arrival to his office. He puffed his pipe again and focused his old pale eyes on me before explaining that a rumor had spread across the academy campus that I was involved in extracurricular activities with questionable students. I did not lie, and I have no intention of concealing the truth from anyone that hears this tale. Full disclosure is necessary in order for guilt and blame to be placed where they belong. When I arrived at Carbuncle Academy 3 years prior, one of my first interactions with the students was actually near the East Gate. Another student, a senior, had just plummeted from the rampart and smashed their skull all over the courtyard below. Dozens of students and teachers were trying to get a look at the grisly scene. One in particular, a young medical orderly named Herbert, told me that the student who had committed suicide had been involved in strange behaviors surrounding a church that sat in the South Courts. I have always had an inquisitive mind, and it bothered me that somebody with a bright future ahead of them would toss it all away after a single visit to an old religious institution, and so I traveled there myself. According to others that I met during my time here, many believed that the church was not made by human hands. It had an otherworldly feel about it, and people gathered there to express their interest in the unknown. The leader of these congregants was named Severn, Thomas Severn, and he greeted me like a sheep to be brought to slaughter. Considering how easily I was roped into this mess, that analogy proves true in more ways than one. Severn explained to me that the land around Carbuncle Academy was considered sacred by the local people, and of course the immigrants that settled and took over and built the academic buildings had no interest in such superstitions and plundered the land for their own benefit. The church, he claimed, was the only last remnant of the old world. I asked him about these strange rumors surrounding the church and the student that had committed suicide, and he told me that there were star charts that some students studied here in the church that the teachers considered questionable. Apparently, they showed systems that didn't match modern astrology, and therefore they were deemed inferior. The student that had jumped from the wall had somehow learned more about these charts, and that knowledge had caused them to end their life. I told all of this to Headmaster Marsh, explaining that ever since that encounter, I had dabbled in the esoteric along with Herbert and Severn. I had come to theorize that the charts which baffled so many were actually not showing any stars that we were familiar with at all, but rather from an age long past, where these skies were still luminous in this area. I also admitted to him, believed that the charts were created by visitors from the stars. Saying such things out loud made me feel foolish in front of such a learned man, but to my surprise he only puffed his pipe and nodded in agreement. I had heard you were writing such papers under a pseudonym, trying to see if any of the other teachers in the academy agreed with you. As it turns out, there is a chapter of the school's history that has been covered up, which relates to your own investigations, and that is where the story of Zwain comes in. Headmaster Marsh explained to me that the board of directors had agreed to keep the works of Zwain under lock and key almost 100 years ago. But over the past few generations, things got forgotten and a few of the papers that the cult leader had written were able to leak. And the star charts in the books that I had been studying at the church in secret were actually part of those papers. But are you saying that there's truth to the ramblings of a fictional story where he claimed to have seen aliens? I asked. The story, which I can summarize, connected to the meteor shower that Marsh had already told me about. During the late 1880s, Zwain said that large monolithic objects fell from the sky all across Dunwich County. He believed these objects were actually from the Earth's moon, and they revealed that these aliens were living amongst us. It had sounded insane when I had studied it, but the papers had included detailed descriptions of the aliens and illustrations. The beings looked like massive slugs with thousands of eyes and skin as smooth as silver. Moon beasts, he had called them, and he claimed that the crash of the monoliths was the first step in their plan for coming to Earth. We had hoped to keep these matters private, but because of your own meddling, we've attracted the interest of a third party, somebody that wants to invest in this goose chase, Marsh told me. And to my surprise, he told me that this new company wanted to hire me full-time as a medical professional. You understand, of course, this is a sort of employment would be off the record and the academy would deny any involvement, Marsh warned. I was still dumbstruck by this sudden turn of events, so I did my best to keep my feet on the ground and recap what was happening. So, a fresh-faced entrepreneur company wants to hire me as a medical professional based off my theories relating to esoteric magic and star charts from ancient cults, I asked, rubbing the back of my neck sheepishly. It all sounded a bit outlandish. That's all I know for now. Mr. Lang is meant to contact you shortly and give you further detail. But I should also advise this is not the sort of position that you turn down, James. Your papers make the academy look bad. We're doing you a favor by letting it slide and getting you out of our hair rather than kicking you onto the streets. I grit my teeth, trying to think fast as I stood up and looked at his taxidermy trophies. If that's the case, then it would be awful for anybody to realize that you were ostracizing me just because I spoke the truth, I countered. Marsh raised a weary eyebrow. He knew that I was threatening him. What do you want? All we want is to make this go away. Let Osset have the headache, he said tiredly. I knew my demands before he even finished speaking. Herbert and Severn, their expertise in these fields exceeds mine and their insights will be valuable. They will be joining me for this new assignment, I told him. Marsh promised he would make it so, and so he did. I didn't really pay much attention to the details of our transfer to the small town of St. Mavis. There was a clinic there that was reopened for Osset a few months back, and that was where I got to meet Lang. He was a tall, dark-haired Asian man with a brutish spirit, and most of that first meeting is a bit of a blur. I was too eager to find out what sort of work my colleagues and I would be assigned to pay attention to, especially because I knew it meant some of the theories that I had written about might be true. When I expressed such excitement to Lang, he promptly offered to give me the charts and notes that were connected to the scandal the Academy so vehemently wanted to cover up. The Zwain incident, he called it. For posterity, I'll provide a short summary of what we found in those notes before I explain what we did with this knowledge. Despite being a religious zealot, I was surprised in the writings of Abraham Zwain to find that he was a learned man, and he studied astrology and philosophy quite avidly. He included quotes from Shintoism and even ancient Mayan texts in his writings, which all centered around the belief that the world we live in is not the only one that exists. In short, Zwain saw through the monoliths a secondary realm that exists alongside the one that we live and breathe on. The true world, as he called it, sounded starkly different than the flourishing life of Earth. Zwain said on the other side of the mirror, life hardly existed at all. There were long streaking lines of white and strange tall buildings that defied architectural standards of our world. Corridors and stairwells that panned whole galaxies and seemed to circle black holes. He theorized that these places were connected somehow to the star charts from the church, and that the church itself was in fact a conduit which held more power in our universe than others. A conduit, he claimed, was the result of the collected memory of the culture around that spot. The longer the collective memory could recall details about the location of the true world that existed there, the longer the location would still exist in our world as well. This explained why the members of the congregation felt an otherworldly connection. When they saw and prayed in the pews, they were actually sliding in and out of an alternate dimension. We're hoping we can try to learn more about this collective memory that he spoke about. We begin trials tomorrow, Lang explained. I should have had further questions about all of this, but the sheer excitement to be a part of the groundbreaking discovery was so overwhelming that I kept them to myself. The next day, we had about a dozen people show up to participate in what Lang called a clinical trial. The drugs we administer here are not FDA approved, of course, so we'll be signing waivers and non-disclosure agreements. You'll be paid once the 6-week period has come to an end. In private, he explained to me that each patient would be given a slow drip of psychedelic drugs and other substances that were designed to enhance neurological functions. I began the testing immediately. It took less than 48 hours for one of the subjects to die. I would like to say that I knew their name or that I understood why they had died, but I can't say either of those things because I would be lying. I had just finished a shift rotation on the other side of the facility where we were working to manufacture the equipment for these samples when I heard a loud scream from the patient area. My natural instinct was to run and assist. Herbert was there holding down this patient as she cried horribly and shook and vomited. After a full recovery about an hour later, I took the time to obtain a statement. You were given approximately 4 doses before you experienced this unfortunate side effect. Could you describe what caused this or what you feel went wrong? The patient was looking at us like we were strangers even though we had been there for a while now. True, we hardly knew each other, but the level of distrust was disheartening. I encouraged openness, especially due to the health benefits. I'm starting to think that this might be a lie, she said as she coughed up more blood. Per standard protocol, I urged them to explain what caused their outburst. You'll think that I'm crazy, but I saw something slinking in the shadows. It felt like I was back there in those corridors, running from it. The halls never ended and the strange shadow just kept getting closer. I was soon aghast to discover that 4 other patients had similar experiences and I had missed them. That couldn't be a coincidence. When I told Lang about it, his response troubled me even more. Increase their dosage and monitor their brain activity. I want to get a clear picture of what they're seeing the next time that they have an episode. Are you suggesting that we actively place our patients in harm's way? I asked. We are only letting their mental state be at risk. Their physical body remains here. We have no means of crossing over to the other side, and neither do the creatures they are envisioning, Lang said dismissively. I wasn't so sure that was a solid excuse, but I was obeying orders still and not questioning the methods. I wanted to learn more and it felt like we were finally making progress, so I did as I was told. The results began to trickle again over the next month. Our patients were sharing the same nightmare. I documented what I could and found the notations even more terrifying than I care to admit. The first pair, a man and a woman, reported that the dream consisted of a labyrinth, much like the ancient Grecian mythos. This one seemed to be haunted by a beast that clawed at my patients' minds long after they woke up. The bear, it reeks of death, it hunts us relentlessly. We walked the halls for days trying to find a place to hide, but each path we took, even it felt like we were going forward, it wound us back around to the core of that awful maze. When they described the maze, the third patient said sometimes that there were doors and stairs. They did not always appear, but when they did, they would lead to different segments of this starry world. One led to a hotel. The rooms were always empty, but the patients would talk about screams and crying in the empty rooms, something trying to dig its way out from under. They often felt like their feet were heavier when they went inside these rooms, so they marked them as dangerous and avoided them as best as they could. Another talked about a forest. I found this framework quite interesting because it seemed to follow the same principles as the hallways. The forest would snag and twist about, circling a lonesome mountain that the patients never seemed able to reach. They would hear distant static that was luring them to the mountain, but the closer they got, the more the massive landmass would re-maneuver itself. Lang called these infinite corridors the key to our knowledge of the true world. He wanted more information and told me to continue to increase the dosages. It all seemed to be progressing well until the first suicide. It had been almost 3 months since we had started these human tests. Most of the people that we were using had lost sanity. Others seemed to have been driven to stay inside the dream world and refused to wake up. The patient that passed away was actually one of Herbert's, a young man that came to the clinical trial for money to support his family. He was only meant to stay for a week. He was given the max dosage to enter the shared consciousness faster, and we documented what we learned via a new method Lang wanted to try, where the dreams were projected onto a screen. The subject, whom I must admit I never learned the name of, was immediately thrust into the corridors as soon as the syringe had pierced his skin. His readings were similar to somebody who had fallen from a great height. There were rows of doors in front of him, all marked very similarly with the number 3 on them. He approached the first one and tested it out, swinging it open to see another corridor that stretched for miles with glowing blue lights on either side. Before he went in, the subject tried the next door and found the exact same thing. Then they tried another door and another until they were surrounded by open doors that all seemed to lead to the blue, fiery hallway. They reluctantly entered, and I whispered to Herbert if he had ever seen this portion of the alternate dimension before. I had been doing some studying of their mental health as they go into the true world. If I'm not mistaken, the halls and the mazes they find themselves in are of their own making. Each time that they're tossed into this labyrinth, they are making new pathways that intersect and grow the maze, he told me. I was fascinated by that theory, but too focused on the feed to provide any sort of insight on what it might mean. There was a single door in front of the subject. This one was already open, and inside there was a slender woman wearing a familiar outfit. "That looks like the uniforms from Osset," I commented, trying to get a better look at the woman. She was a redhead with sparkly blue eyes and, I'll admit, even attractive. She was mouthing words we couldn't understand to the subject, and I was trying my best to keep an eye on his physical reaction. Whatever she's saying to him, it's causing quite a spike in his adrenaline, Herbert said as he reached for the device that would take the subject out of the dream. "Oh wait, we need to see what happens. This could help us," I said. I regret pushing things that day. The woman kept talking, the levels kept rising, and then at the end of whatever speech she had given to our subject, she took out a syringe. It reminded me of the same one that we administered to place them within the dream. She plunged it into the patient's neck, and in that instant they woke. They gasped for air as if they had been drowning, their gaze confused and fearful as they looked at us. "What happened in there?" I asked, but they didn't respond. Before they even dared to try and comprehend the situation, the patient jumped from their beds and ran toward a nearby railing. They ran straight on past the railing, falling to their death without even a scream passing their lips. An autopsy revealed nothing out of the ordinary for their brain function. Lang considered the whole incident just a simple misunderstanding and miscalculation, but I wasn't so sure. I kept replaying the footage of the blue-eyed woman in my head over and over. Who was she? Did she work for us? What had she told the subject to make them want to kill themselves? Over the next few weeks, those questions were compounded by even more issues with the patients. Some were refusing treatment, harming themselves to stop their dreams. They just wanted to go home. I felt sorry for them, but Lang insisted that their work was hardly finished. We've only scratched the surface on what this maze is, what sort of abilities it can give us. We need more players in this game, James. Can you help us? I knew what he was asking. He wanted me to be a recruiter, and I played that part quite well. I went back to the academy this time as a representative of the Osset Company. Even though this campus had been my home for nearly 2 years, stepping back into it now was overwhelming. I didn't feel very welcome anymore. A few students stopped and saw my badge that represented Osset and made a few hushed comments amongst themselves, and then they zigzagged around to avoid being near me. I turned, about to ask what they were saying, when somebody bumped into me and dropped their coffee on my clothes. Watch it, I said, jumping back and looking at the young woman. She had curly red hair and freckles and blue eyes. She reminded me of the same woman that I had seen in the visions of our patients. But how was that possible? I'm so sorry, are you okay? She asked as I tried to ignore the burning liquid that covered my shirt. Fine, it's fine. Do I know you? I said as I helped her gather the papers that she had dropped. I couldn't help but notice familiar esoteric symbols and graphs on the paper. Was she a student of Zwain's teachings too? I don't think so, but you know me now. I'm Emma Carter, she told me as she spotted the logo on my shirt. You're with the corporation that we're contracting with, she asked in surprise. You're familiar with us. Headmaster Marsh made an announcement about a month ago that we had a new internship program happening with the company. But I'll admit that's not the only time I heard about you. Let's just say that there are a few ugly rumors circling about the people that go to work for them, Emma told me. Rumors? What kind? She pointed toward a nearby study lounge and I followed her to discuss this privately. You probably know this firsthand, but the people who go to work for you, they never come back and finish their studies. They disappear, she whispered. I can see it in your eyes. You know that it's worse than that, Emma said while I averted my gaze. I thought about some of the things that had happened to the patients that I had tested with. I didn't want to think that we were hurting them, but I couldn't deny that it was dangerous. Some of them had already tried to off themselves and some had been successful. I had been pushing these things out of my mind, focusing on the endgame for the research. But something about the way this young woman spoke made me pause and realize that I was being a monster. What is it? What do you know? Emma asked. I know that we've been dabbling in scientific discoveries that will shake the very foundation of our entire human race. Alternate dimensions that connect via endless halls. I paused to see if any of this sounded familiar and decided to make a guess about her studies. It's what Pastor Zwain was researching almost 100 years ago. Am I right? Emma actually looked surprised that I was so forthcoming. I think I might know something that can help you, she told me. She wrote a time and place for the South Dormitory to meet that very night. A group of us have been getting close to unlocking what Swain learned all those years ago. Bring your own calculations and I think we can reach a solid understanding of this alternate dimension. I'll admit I was stunned as she knew so much about this subject. It made me think about what I had seen in that vision. Was that an alternate reality where Emma had already become a member of Osset? Yet she was transforming my patients into monsters in that nightmarish place, I thought. If I decided to help her and we discovered a way to enter the true world right here on this campus, would it cause the same inevitable reaction for her in the future? Was this what fate was? I didn't have the answers, but the questions troubled me. It felt as though an unseen force was pushing me along. I didn't even feel that my free will was existent as I realized that the only course forward would be to meet with Emma and the other Zwayne acolytes. Whatever this power is, it wants us to find it, I decided. The true world was almost within reach and new information that could reinterpret the entire universe. As a man of science, I felt there could be no other way to go. I checked the map of the campus where Emma wanted us to meet. The location was obvious. The dark church where all of this started almost 100 years ago. I took a break at the cafeteria and took off my coat to eat a fine lunch. With my logo hidden, none of the students gave me dirty looks, and it was nice to think about my days as a learner here. So much had changed since then. The reflection made me feel guilty because of how I was now using these same students for the experiments of Osset. What had I become? I lost my appetite with that thought, collected my things, and I went toward the dark church. At this time of the day, the ancient structure was empty. Candles were lit through from a morning service, and I saw several books lying on the ground around what looked like a magical sigil. I knew better to think that this was a mundane act of worship, so I leaned forward to get a better look at the written words. But what I saw made little sense, at least at first. All it looked to me was gibberish. As I kept repeating the words in my head, somehow the translation came to me though, as if the book was telling me what it was trying to convey. Here the disciple Bifo lies, in sleepless nights he bleeds. Awake in his chaos, let loose his fury. A pit formed before my eyes, the endless void ripping open to give me a glimpse into eternity. This was the true world. I looked around. I should have been waiting for Emma, but the new portal beckoned for me to investigate. From the shadows I saw light, beautiful and ancient. It swirled and shimmered and shook the room. Immediately the candles fell down on the ground, the fire shaking and transforming as blood and dark slime was emerging from their wax, feeding this nameless monster. And then the walls around me formed reflections of my own self. No longer was I standing in the Carbuncle Academy. No longer was I in the world that I knew and loved. This was something else, dark and mysterious, yet it only spoke to me the truth. As these swirls of anger and blood formed a shape, its unimaginable face became clear to me, and when I saw what the mirror was showing me, I screamed. The reflection shattered into millions of pieces, and I realized how foolish we had been to even step foot into this place. I saw others trapped in the labyrinth, ones that I hadn't met yet. I can only assume they came from other timelines or dimensions, wandering this place and becoming faceless monsters. They could smell my fear. I stepped forward to try and get the attention of one that looked almost human. He had cut out his own eyes and he was mumbling about like a madman. "We cannot see the world beyond ours, for it invites death. Every path, every direction it leads only to our extinction," he whispered as I passed by. The other creatures were feeding on themselves, crawling and making hallways of flesh as I ran through to find Emma, or to find anything that reminded me of the same reality that I came from. I saw her at last, standing like she had in that first vision, with a syringe in her hand. But she wasn't alone this time. The tunnel of flesh fell away and I was trapped in a white room with no clear dimensions. Carter stood there next to an operation chair, and beside her was an older man, perhaps in his early 90s, who greeted me cordially. "You're the one we have to thank for this new discovery, or so I've heard. It's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Wesley," he said. "How do you know me?" I asked. My voice sounded hoarse. "The walls of this place whisper your name often. In almost every iteration of these endless corridors, your name is the one that's being chanted wherever we ask who sent them here. It would seem that the entities that control this corridor have used you and people similar to you in almost every single dimension to keep themselves fed. You were puppets pulled here by forces beyond your understanding, And now the threshold widens and a new reality will be swallowed up, he said. The experiments weren't unlocking any potential for humanity. This was always a trap, I realized. It took you long enough, Emma said as strange faceless beings strapped me down. What are you going to do with me? You don't belong here anymore. There are still other places where a harvest must take place. We can handle the workload here, and you will remain our puppet. I looked at the older man, a realization of who he was. You're Wayne, the one that killed those students all those years ago, I said. Killed? Heavens no. I awakened them to their full potential. They are here, part of the endless tapestry. The shared consciousness is a way for our species to live forever, James. What I've done is give them immortality, he cackled. Emma plunged the syringe in my neck. I will fight this. I'll find a way to save you, I told her. She looked sad. Her eyes told me that she believed it was too late. The walls of flesh began to close in. I was drowning in their vitriol and then coming up for air in the dark church. My hands were clammy and shaky as I walked away from the ritual circle. The Emma that I knew was in the doorway, a bit perplexed by my strange behavior. Dr. Wesley, are you still trying to recruit us? She asked. No, sweet child, you must flee from here. Only devil's work is being done here. We have to get away, I told her. Emma didn't want to leave with me that evening, and it was the last chance that I got to speak with her. I sent in my resignation to Osset the following evening as I caught a train to Clear River. They didn't seem to hold a grudge, but instead pressed forward with their work to map and understand that labyrinth undeterred. I tried again to reach out to Emma, only to learn that she had already decided to join the corporation. It feels like no matter what I've done, fate has found a way for the endless halls to grow, the doors to grow more numerous. Soon I suspect that many others will find their way into these back rooms of the mind and become trapped there. Spread the warning and stop this madness as much as you can. Please, we might not be too late. At the very least, we might be able to be prepared for what comes next. Today's episode is sponsored by HelloFresh. Whether your resolution is to save money, eat better, or stress less, HelloFresh is here to help you do all three. Say hello to your most delicious year yet with fresh ingredients and chef-crafted recipes at a price you'll like, delivered right to your door. Make saving time your breeziest resolution with quick, convenient recipes. Just choose your meals and select your delivery date. HelloFresh handles the meal planning and shopping, so all that you have to do is open your weekly box of pre-portioned ingredients and step-by-step recipes to get cooking. My favorite recipe recently has been the meatloaf with creamy thyme sauce. It's hearty and delicious, which is perfect for this time of year. To get started, go to hellofresh.com/MrCreepsFree and use code MrCreepsFree for free breakfast for life. That's one breakfast item per box while your subscription is active. That's free breakfast for life at hellofresh.com/MrCreepsFree with code MrCreepsFree. HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. I'm a pilot for a reputed cargo airline in the US. I've had the most bizarre experience of my flying career and I don't know what to do. It was a normal day in Florida. I had checked my laptop for the flight schedule. I had to go from Miami to Puerto Rico and back. That sounded like great news to me. I could come home on the same day at least. My co-pilot for the flight was a guy named Jim. I immediately took to him during our pre-flight briefings and we stepped into our retrofitted Boeing 737. The first leg of the flight was normal with no turbulence, except for the air traffic control diverting us over Cuba to avoid a bit of stormy-looking clouds over the ocean. We missed the Bermuda Triangle, announced Jim looking at his digital map. "Well, you believe in those fairy tales?" I asked him. I had flown the route a couple of times before and had never noticed anything different about the so-called Bermuda Triangle. It was probably a hoax by some adults living in their parents' basement seeking attention. "Oh, it's real, all right," said Jim seriously. "Why do you think we were diverted over Cuba?" I chuckled. "Diversions happen all the time, Jim. A storm cloud is nothing paranormal." There was no time to discuss this further as we had to prepare for landing. We landed safely, the crew reloaded the plane, and the ground crew started to refuel the aircraft. One of the mechanics came up to me with a frown on his face. Captain, there seems to be a slight issue." "A slight issue, huh?" "Yes, Captain. It looks like a fuel leak in one of the lines." I sighed. Company policy on suspected fuel leaks was to perform an inspection and ground the aircraft, and who knows how long that would take. I called the dispatcher back home, and after consulting with the engineering team, they gave the green light to perform the inspection. And Jim and I had a bit of lunch in the airport, and I was reading some stuff on my phone in the crew room to pass the time. Long story short, after about 6 hours, the mechanics told us that the plane was airworthy once again, and that we could fly back. Heck, at least no passengers were complaining to the management. It was evening and darkness had started to fall. I was a bit happy as the late flight home meant that my flight tomorrow would be rescheduled. This time, though, we were flying right over the Bermuda Triangle, and Jim wasn't happy about it. I just have this eerie sensation. Every time I fly over this, it looks so creepy in the dark. It's because of the endless ocean. It does look pitch dark outside. I joked, and that's where things started to go sideways. There was a jolt and the aircraft shook. I frowned. That's some strong wind." Jim looked scared. "I don't know, Captain, that didn't feel natural." At once, the 737 started to shake uncontrollably, and my heart leapt into my mouth as the aircraft had started to lose altitude. At night, you can't see a thing out of the windshield and over the ocean. It's impossible to gauge your height. Naturally, I started to scan the instruments for any indication of defects. Maybe the engineers had done something wrong. "What is going on?" asked Jim. I grabbed the yoke and tried to force the nose up. "Power back, Jim." Jim pulled the throttle back, and I held the yoke with an iron grip. After a terrifying 2 minutes, the aircraft leveled out and both of us breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe the storm cloud earlier had caused an air pocket, and it was our bad luck to stumble on it. "Oh crap," said Jim, looking out the window, and what I saw made my blood run cold. At night, the white cloud cover that you normally see when flying isn't that visible and depends on the moon. But what I saw defied all explanation. The clouds below us were forming a vortex and were blood red. To my horror, the aircraft started to shudder and the clouds started spinning. I think Jim wet himself as we were being sucked in. The nose tipped towards the swirling vortex that looked like it was a portal to hell. I frantically tried to control the plane, but it was like something else had taken over. The controls were unresponsive, and we were going down fast. Jim and I exchanged a horrified look. We knew that this was it. We were going to crash. Was this how so many countless deaths were caused? An anomaly in the weather that not even our brainiest scientists could figure out. But then something even more bizarre happened. The vortex had seemed to spit us out, and we were flying in a completely different place. It was like we had been transported to another dimension. The sky was darker and the clouds were black and red, and the air was filled with an ominous silence. I couldn't understand what was going on. Scientifically, I rejected the theory of alternate dimensions, but a horrible feeling grew in my chest. Was it real after all? What gave me the creeps even more was the land below us. It looked like the surface of Mars. What the heck just happened? Jim asked, visibly shaken. I don't know, but I think we need to get out of here fast, I replied. I tried to turn the plane around, but the controls were still unresponsive. We were trapped in this otherworldly place with no way out. To make it worse, our navigation system wasn't showing us anything and it was blank. I tried to place a call using our plane's satellite calling system, but it wouldn't connect. Yeah, we were screwed. And that's when things started to get even stranger. I saw something moving outside of the window, something that should not exist. My brain couldn't understand what it was seeing. It was like a shadow, but it had a form at the same time, and it was coming closer and closer. A gray mist started to envelop the aircraft. It was almost as if we were flying into a cloud, only the clouds here were black and red. Jim, do you see that? I asked, my voice shaking. He looked out the window and his eyes widened in terror. Yeah, what is that? The shadowy figure was now just inches away from the plane. It was like it was trying to get inside. I could feel the cold breeze coming through the window, even though the plane was still flying. It was dark and gray and didn't have a proper shape, but it reminded me of the Grim Reaper that you see in some storybooks. Cold drops of sweat formed on my forehead as the entity, or whatever that thing was, formed a long finger with a pointed claw and tapped on the window. We both screamed in terror as the figure suddenly disappeared. But then we heard a voice that sounded like it was coming from inside of the plane. I've been waiting for you. Jim and I looked at each other, both of us paralyzed with fear. Who's there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my bravado gone. No one answered, but we could feel the presence in the cockpit, a presence that was not human. The already cold cockpit got colder and I was paralyzed in fear, too scared to turn around. I saw a gray mist fill the cockpit, and that was the last thing that I remember before blacking out. When I came to, we were back on Earth and flying over the place where we had encountered the portal or whatever that vortex had been. The rest of the journey was in silence, and I have no idea how Jim and I managed to land that aircraft safely. Jim handed in his resignation on the same day, but I decided to stay. We recalled the event perfectly, but decided to not mention it to anyone. I like my job and I don't want to be sent to the therapist, or even worse, have my license revoked. I drove home, gripping the steering wheel of my Ford pickup in fear, not daring to look behind me. I stopped at a fast food joint and ate in the pickup itself. Once I went home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I had lived alone for the majority of my life, and I had never experienced this feeling before. I went to bed immediately after a shower, but I couldn't make myself fall asleep. After an hour of tossing and turning, I managed to sleep, but my dreams were plagued by the shadowy entity who laughed in my face about not believing in the supernatural, and how I would have to pay penance for it. I dreamt that I was trapped in the other dimension and that I had no escape. I woke up, my pillows soaked in sweat despite the air conditioning. I tried to call Jim, only to realize that I didn't have his number. I ate some cornflakes, wondering whom to call, scrolling through my contacts, and then it hit me. I would call Jackson. Jackson was an investigator in the National Transportation Safety Board, and I had met the guy earlier in the airport. He was a loner like me, and we had hung out a couple of times, watching the latest Marvel movies. He wouldn't think that I was slowly going insane anyway, so I called him. Jackson, a guy who was usually light, became serious and told me to stay where I was and to not leave the house. He promised to be there within 2 hours with his team. I heaved a sigh of relief and finished the last of my coffee and realized that my laptop was in my room. I wanted to check if the company had changed my flight. There was no way that I wanted to fly today until Jackson had sorted this mess out. I went into my room and the door slammed closed behind me. An icy feeling settled in my veins as I looked around. None of the windows were open, so it couldn't have been the wind. I crept forward only to stop in my tracks as a gray mist formed in my room, the same gray mist that formed outside our aircraft. I stood paralyzed in fear as a shape started to form out of the gray mist, the shape that formed outside our aircraft yesterday. I stood paralyzed as the thing shot what looked like chains made out of dark gray mist at me, and they wrapped around my ankles. The searing pain jolted me into my senses as I yanked my feet out of its clutches. I screamed and turned open the door, hoping that it wasn't locked, and thankfully it opened. I closed the door behind me as the thing slammed against it, letting out a guttural howl. I fumbled for my keys, ran into the garage, and climbed into my pickup. I pulled out onto the driveway and stared at my house. Had that thing followed me back from yesterday? If so, maybe it had gotten to Jim as well. My ankles weren't faring any better. They looked like they had gotten burnt, and the skin was red and bruised where the chains had touched me. In hindsight, I should have gotten an ice pack from my fridge. I got on the internet and was searching for forums where people have had similar experiences, and I stumbled across this one. Maybe you guys can help me out until Jackson comes. I'm too scared to go back inside. That thing didn't look like it wanted to chat. First of all, thank you all so much for your advice. You have no idea how comforting it was to me to sit in that pickup reading all your advice instead of driving myself crazy. My ankle was killing me, so I decided to take a bottle of water that I had stored in my pickup and wet a cloth that I found inside. I wrapped it over my ankle, and that gave me a bit of relief. I contemplated driving away many times, but I always seemed rooted to the spot, my hands refusing to start my pickup. Anyway, after many tense hours of waiting, I finally spotted Jackson's car pull into the driveway, followed by another official-looking Cadillac. Jackson exited the car along with his team, who were carrying a duffel bag. I got out of my pickup and I shook his hand. "Thanks for coming all the way out here, man," I said, pumping his hand up and down. Jackson nodded towards the two men who were getting out of the Cadillac, and they were quite obviously someone from the government, complete with black suits, ties, and sunglasses. One of the guys had a thick mustache, while the other one looked as if he was devoid of any emotion. What a shocker. They stood, waiting for Jackson to do the introductions. "Right, so guys, this is Chris. Chris, these are my two colleagues from the government." "Let me guess," I said, feeling a bit bolder. "FBI." "I can neither confirm nor deny that statement," said the guy with the mustache. "Anyway, I'm Daniel and the other guy's John." "Yeah, right, like those were their real names anyway." "I'm assuming Jackson would have told you everything," I said, gesturing to my house, which Jackson's team were now taking photos of. Daniel nodded. He did. "So, do you deal with these types of, things?" I asked him. The reply was the usual. "I can neither confirm nor deny that statement." "I can make a coffee if you come in," I said, looking at Jackson, who shook his head. "No, Chris, you can't go back inside until we have a look." "All right," I said. "I need to see if I have been rescheduled from my roster." "Don't worry," said John, speaking for the first time. "We have spoken to your airline captain." An icy finger trailed along my spine. What had these bozos from the government told the airline? Luckily, Jackson saw the look on my face. "Don't worry, Chris. We told them that you're doing some work for us." I breathed a sigh of relief. "Any news about Jim, the co-pilot?" "Jim has left the state," said Daniel, shaking his head. "We have him under observation as well." "Will whatever you guys are doing take long?" I asked. I didn't want to stay in my driveway and announce to the entire neighborhood that something was up with my house. Jackson looked gloom. We need to take some energy readings here. I think you should go and book yourself a hotel for today. I sighed. Can I at least pack? The suits shook their heads at once. No, Captain, leave everything as it is. After a final handshake, I got into my pickup and went to the town, searching for a hotel to spend the day in. I had some lunch from a restaurant and checked into a newly built 3-star. The room was okay, but as I surveyed the room, I had an unsettling feeling. Don't get me wrong, one of the perks of being an airline pilot is that we get to stay in amazing hotels, but I never experienced this feeling that made the hair on the back of my head stand up. It was as if I were not alone. I shrugged it off and I opened up the curtains. I had no illusions. I was technically trapped here until the G-men told me everything was okay. Jackson had given me a device that he told me to use in an emergency, whatever that meant. I looked at the phone-like device that looked very much like an old Nokia. Maybe I was supposed to press the green call button and the phone would do its magic. Luckily, my phone had full charge, so I closed the curtains, hopped into the comfy bed and decided to watch something on Netflix to pass the time. I nearly dropped the phone as I opened up the app, to be greeted by a picture of a woman smiling like a maniac. I browsed through the movie collection, only to be greeted by horror movie after horror movie. I threw the phone across the pillow and decided to go to sleep. As my head hit the pillow, I was greeted by that thing. It covered me with its shadowy presence and laughed in my face as I struggled to escape that dimension. I tried my best to at least see what it looked like, but the only thing I could see were the eyes. The eyes that glowed like they were burning coal. I tried to wake myself up, and just as I had had that thought, the entity smiled. Or at least I thought that it had smiled. I woke up suddenly, sweating profusely, and tried to move my hand to wipe my forehead, when to my horror, my hands would not move. I tried to move my legs, but it seemed like they were made out of lead. My heart leapt out of my chest as I looked at myself and saw that my entire body was covered with gray smoke, only it didn't feel like smoke, more like if lead were a heavy liquid. Something told me to look at the armchair and let out a whimper of fear. Sitting on it was the thing itself, and this time I saw it properly for the first time. Its cloak was made of the same gray mist that covered me, and its face was the thing that puzzled me. The face didn't have a form, just the burning coal eyes and the mouth with dark gray lips. The thing smiled, revealing jagged, sharp teeth that didn't resemble anything human. "Chris," it moaned. The voice sounded like dragging nails on a chalkboard. I tried to cover my ears, only to be reminded that this thing had me in its power. My usually gruff voice came out like the squeak of a mouse. "What do you want?" I shuddered as the thing smiled, showing me even more of its teeth that looked like they were suspiciously covered in blood. "Can't you remember?" No, I'm sorry. I should have slept with that dang emergency phone near me. This thing was going to give me a heart attack soon. "Oh, that's too bad." I won't lie, I nearly wet myself as the thing got up from the armchair in the room and came near me. But something was happening to its face. It was changing into the face of Kate. "Open up," yelled a voice from outside of the room. "NTSB officials, open up." The thing hissed and then vanished, taking the gray smoke with it. The door unlocked, and thank God for the hotels these days having emergency overrides, and Jackson walked in looking anxious. "What happened?" he asked me, and I sat up and looked at him. It came again. He looked at me sheepishly. "Sorry, Chris, that device I gave you to contact me is designed to send a remote alert to us when it detects strange energy, and we keyed it to the anomaly that we found in your house." "Speaking of that," I said, opening a soft drink that I found in the minibar. "What did you guys find anyway?" "There's an energy fluctuation in your house, mainly your bedroom. but I want to know more about this entity that visited you today." I told Jackson the entire story and he nodded. "God, my mistake. I think it's attached itself to something that you took on that flight." "Dude," I stared at him, "that could even be my house keys or the keys to my truck." "Yeah, that's the thing. Jackson, that thing, it looked a bit like Kate." Jackson paled. I knew that I had him, but before that, let me tell you about Kate. Kate was an absolute goddess of a woman that I met when I had just started working for the airline. She was a pilot herself and worked for a charter airline. I saw her in the airport restaurant and I was immediately in love. I approached her a bit shyly and asked her out, and to my great surprise, it worked. We started meeting up for a few coffees and we decided to date. I loved her a lot and I knew that she would be the perfect woman for me and I the perfect man for her. Well, that was until she had vanished. I don't need to tell you how devastated I was. I had never had a successful relationship in high school or college, one that lasted for a long time anyway, and to see Kate disappear off the face of the earth, well, it was heartbreaking. I went to the police, but apparently, a boyfriend reporting an adult missing isn't enough. She's an adult, they said. Her employer had no clue about her disappearance and was concerned. The police agreed to put an alert, but nothing came of it after both of us got involved. Months turned into years, and so did my hope. "Jackson," I said a bit more forcefully. He turned to the window. "You're going to hate me after this." The doorbell rang and in came John. He put a hand on Jackson. John had been listening in on our conversation. Typical government. 12 years ago, the NTSB was alerted to a missing aircraft over the Bermuda Triangle. I gripped my armchair tightly. The pilot of that aircraft was Kate. I looked at Jackson. "You covered it up. You've been covering up every single disappearance in the triangle, haven't you?" I saw red. I stood up, as if that would do any good, but I was brought back to earth by Jackson. "Help us then." "What?" John cleared his throat. "Help us, Captain. Join us to find Kate and solve the mystery once and for all." Of course I agreed. The unnamed agency spoke to my airline, who put me on paid leave and told me not to bring anything with me, including my clothes. My pickup key, house key, and tack, even glasses would stay behind. It would only be me. Yeah, this included my phone and laptop. The agency, whoever they were, paid my hotel bill, gave me some new clothes, and even got me some new glasses. They even bought me a new phone, and not a crappy one at that. I'm still in the hotel currently, and I'll be leaving shortly. Jackson and his team don't want to take the risk of flying, so it's 8 hours over land. I'm going to fall asleep on the way. It's almost 7 o'clock here anyway. I haven't seen even a slight sign of the thing since Jackson and them had left. That was a good sign, right? But only if I knew how wrong I was. I reached into my wallet to take out my credit cards. Yeah, Jackson wanted those as well. His instructions were to cancel them and get new ones posted to some weird-looking address. I had effectively given up all my worldly possessions to this unnamed agency. My fingers brushed against a talisman, an object that brought tears to my eyes. Kate had given me it a long time ago, saying that her mom considered it good luck, and to those of you who want to know, I hadn't met her parents yet. She was planning on introducing me to them later, well, until she disappeared. Anyway, as I took out the talisman, I felt a searing pain in my hand, almost as if it were on fire. I clutched my hand and I dropped the thing on the floor, where the gray mist was leaking from it into the real world. In a panic, I quickly called Jackson. Daniel barged into my room. I was to have no privacy, it seemed, and the minute that he came in, the gray mist miraculously disappeared. Daniel nodded. "I'm gonna stay in the room if you don't mind, and we'll take care of the talisman." "Yeah, whatever, man. I need to wash my face a bit." I went into the washroom and a strong sense of foreboding greeted me. I stopped suddenly. Was that a gray mist leaking through the ventilation duct? I slowly turned towards the mirror and nearly shat myself. The thing was right behind me, smiling with an all too wide grin. I quickly grabbed the hairdryer. Yeah, I know, but that was the only thing that I could find to defend myself, but there was nobody there. What the heck? I looked in the mirror and to my utter disbelief, the thing appeared to be behind me in the reflection. Daniel, in here! Daniel rushed to the washroom, but predictably the thing smiled smugly and vanished. Daniel had a very unwelcome explanation. Sorry, Captain, the entity appears to be attached to something of yours. Is it the talisman? Daniel frowned. No, Captain, we can't say for sure, but I think it's something in this room. Can't you find out which it is? No, Captain, not until we test every single thing you took on that plane. Yeah, right, I can't even take a dump alone without that thing bothering me. Jackson agreed to move the timeline up and we leave in 10 minutes. I have a strong feeling the suits won't let me contact anyone once I'm inside their facility, so you won't be hearing from me for a while. I'm going to find out what happened to Kate, even if it means walking into hell myself. Jackson and his friends from the NTSB took me to an undisclosed facility in God knows where. I'm not joking, I spent the better part of the 7-hour journey napping, and guess what? That thing didn't plague me at all. I guess the theory of it being attached to something I took on that flight was true after all. Anyway, we arrived at the office of the NTSB. The security had a look at Jackson and the suit's IDs, and after giving me a one-over, my driver's license was under their custody anyways. They waved us through. Instead of going through the front door like normal people would, the crew went into a subterranean garage. They parked the Cadillac and we went into an elevator, and Jackson surprised me by inserting a card into a card reader. The lift knew where to go as it started to descend, and no, the digital display didn't indicate the floor numbers. I had a sneaking suspicion that we were going to a highly secretive facility that only a few people knew about, and I was proven right as the elevator doors opened. We piled into a dimly lit lobby and were greeted by a big made man. Welcome, Team Bravo, I see you've returned with our guest. Yes, boss, said Daniel. The boss smiled back at Jackson. Can't say I'm surprised. Congrats on the promotion, Jackson. Thank you, boss. And do forgive me, Captain, he said, looking at me. We were unable to shake anyone's hands as it can cause issues with the energy fluctuations. And you can call me boss. All right, boss, I said, trying to be a part of the team. The boss was satisfied with our answers and nodded at Jackson, who no doubt was the leader of Team Bravo. Jackson told us to follow him and went down a corridor that had several doors set into it. We opened one and were greeted by an apartment. Did I forget to mention that there were no windows by any chance? I guessed that we were underground. We, or rather the G-men, dumped their equipment on the floor and faced me. Jackson raised his hands. You might be having a lot of questions that will answer. Fine, I said, first of all, who are you guys? And Daniel was the one that answered. We are a division of the NTSB known as EDO, or the Extraordinary Divisions Organization, and we answer directly to the Pentagon. We research anomalies reported by anybody focusing on transportation. I turned to Jackson. Hold on, buddy, I'm pretty sure you were just an NTSB inspector last time that I checked. Jackson shrugged. That was until I got promoted. Heck, that's why we didn't tell you anything until you signed the NDA. Yeah, well, I just broke it. John opened up the duffel bag and took out a pack of what looked like a computer monitor. Truth be told, Captain, we're very interested in the Bermuda Triangle, and this is the first time we've experienced anyone with, After Effects. So what's the plan? I asked him, sitting on the sofa. The G-men shrugged. We're on quarantine. We need to be in this decontamination chamber for a few hours until the boss man briefs us. Wow, I was stuck with these guys for another couple of hours. Jackson assured me that his old team was taking care of the belongings that I had left behind, and that I would only have to ask to get something provided to me. This was early in the morning, so I decided to take a nap. The apartment had 2 rooms, and I decided to bunk with Jackson. I slept soundly without the thing disturbing my peace. We were called down for breakfast, and the boss informed us that we were to be present at 9:30 in the briefing room sharp. That was fine with me. 9:30 saw us in a normal conference room set up with a smartboard and a couple of chairs. The 4 of us, along with the boss, whose name no one knew, and a couple of people in what looked like military uniforms, were present at the briefing. The boss started to speak at first, his deep voice resonating in the small room. Ladies and gentlemen, as you are all aware by now, our primary focus is the Bermuda Triangle. The smartboard flickered to life, highlighting the area on the map. The pilot, Captain Chris, and his first officer Jim of Redacted Airlines experienced something that interests us greatly. Captain, why don't you explain what happened? I stood up and recounted the story, secretly hoping that nobody laughed at me or that I was secretly in a psych hospital. Everybody's faces, however, displayed either horror or shock. Jackson cleared his throat. For the record, everyone, Jim recounts no sightings of the entity except the initial encounter. We have concluded that the entity has anchored itself to a possession of the captains that he took on that flight. I raised my hand. Captain? Wait, you government types seriously believe this? The boss smiled and motioned a guy in a lab coat, a scientist, to speak to us. The scientist stood up and went to the podium. All right, folks, to answer your question, Captain, we believe in the laws of energy thoroughly. We have observed that there is a slight anomaly in the area of the Bermuda Triangle. In terms of this energy, when Jackson here reported your incident to his superiors, we were ordered to step in. We have found that the energy signature of your house is different to these surroundings, suggesting that something extraordinary is going on. So nothing paranormal? I asked him cautiously. The scientist smiled. I'm afraid not, Captain. It's all to do with the energy. Well, then what about the flight then? That place we went to? I asked him. Don't blame me, I came here to find answers. The scientist looked a bit less sure of himself. That is still under observation, to be honest. The boss motioned for the scientist to sit down and dominated the podium once again. What we are interested in is this entity that you spoke about, Captain. We have been observing the triangle for the past few years, and yet we haven't observed such energy spikes as we are now. We are testing your belongings for traces of residual energy, but it is still under progress. For the benefit of Team Bravo, said another military-type man, we managed to borrow a satellite that is recording every single thing that's going on in that area. We will keep observing the energy fluctuations and brief you once we're done. That's it, gentlemen. The briefing left me confused and tossing and turning in my bunk bed. Was there such a huge amount of energy that could create another world? I didn't buy it for a second. The science team had a breakthrough after 2 weeks. The higher-ups were pressing the boss. They needed the satellite back. I don't know how to explain this, he said, calling us to the office, but the talisman seems to have another energy signature emitting from it. Kate believed in it a lot, I said a bit angrily. She should have worn that thing when she went over the triangle the day she went missing. Maybe she would have survived. I pored over the NTSB records for the incident, by the way, and nothing on that 3-page folder told me anything useful, other than the time and day she had gone on the flight which I brought the attention of the boss. He surveyed the 4 of us. I want you, Team Bravo, to take up the challenge of finding out what goes on in the triangle. Our analysts have informed me that on the night of the full moon, at precisely 9:39 p.m., a sharp spike only for a fraction of a second at a particular point in the triangle occurs. Let me guess, boss, says Daniel. It coincided with the captain's flight path. The boss pointed his pen at Daniel. "Attaboy." "Sir," began John a bit fearfully. "You're not suggesting that we fly into the triangle, are you?" The boss grinned. "But I am." Things escalated pretty fast from that point onward. The full moon was approaching in a week and we had to be prepared. Strangely enough, the talisman didn't burn me when I held it this time, leading Jackson to suggest that maybe something that I had in my wallet at the time was triggering it. The science team had several opinions that the triggers were the stuff that I kept in my wallet. Anyway, we exercised and geared up as the military team would say for that day as it loomed closer. The team would be the 4 of us, 3 grunts and the 2 pilots. The boss and the science team would run the ground ops from the base. Oh, and before you ask, no, I still had no idea where we were. I slept on the way mostly. I suspect the G-men might have spiked my coffee, but at least I got good free food here. On the day of departure, we loaded our backpacks, double-checked our communications equipment, and ran a bunch of last-minute checks. My jaw dropped when the boss led us to the hangar. We were to fly on one of the aircrafts in development, something that defied all explanation. It looked like an alien craft with its slim and sleek design. It looked like a cross between a plane and a helicopter, and I admired its stealthy-looking design. The boss was nervous. The Pentagon wasn't happy about loaning this bad boy. Try not to get a scratch on it, huh? The interior was exactly like the exterior of the aircraft. Plush leather seats that looked like they belonged on a luxury jet awaited us, and of course, me being me couldn't resist checking out the cockpit. Let's be very clear here, there are 2 types of pilots in their late 40s like me. Pilots who hate computerized modern pilot cockpits and prefer the old-style gauge-type systems. And the other ones who love the computerization and digital screens. That was me. For the life of me, I couldn't understand why on earth anyone would want to read off the gauges that took ages to find. Anyway, I was blown away by the sheer design of it all. Large digital displays surrounded the pilots, who had joysticks to control the aircraft. I gave the pilots the thumbs up and went to join the team. After a final comm check of our gear, we got the all clear to take off. The takeoff was extremely smooth, and once in the air, the pilot grinned at us. "I don't know if anybody told you, but this baby can reach almost 3 times the speed of sound. So buckle up, gents, and we're flying at 40,000 feet to avoid the other aircraft." "Wow," said Daniel, clapping his hands. "We'll be there in no time then." I looked at the team. I had gotten to know them well during the 2 weeks, and Daniel was an outgoing guy. Jackson was, well, Jackson, but John spoke only when necessary, and that wasn't much. Anyways, once we had reached our cruising altitude, Jackson sent the grunts to the cockpit. There was something that he wanted to tell us, and only us. He indicated that we switch off our comms and said in a grave voice, "I'm not buying that energy explanation for a second. There's something sinister going on there, and we needed to stop at all costs. Got it?" He looked hard at me and I nodded. "Roger." The other men followed, with John simply nodding. The NTSB had provided us with what they called energy blasters, which shot superheated plasma at anything that it encountered. I had a feeling that the aircraft was fitted with something equally frightening as well. And in case you were wondering, I, being a private citizen, was not allowed to carry the firearm, but I had the talisman with me. Something equally dangerous. I noticed a change in the pitch of the engines, and the pilots called over the intercom stating that we were a couple of miles away from insertion into the triangle. We buckled our seatbelts and waited for the inevitable. The aircraft jolted suddenly to the right, and we looked at each other in grim determination. This was it. I looked outside as the aircraft suddenly rightened itself. "Wow," said Jackson, looking mesmerized by the clouds starting to form a vortex, slowly spinning and gaining speed. I looked at my watch. It was 9:39. The aircraft started to shudder as the pilots engaged the corrective actions. In my defense, I didn't have the privilege of practicing this maneuver 1,000 times in the simulator when I did it. "What the heck is that?" shrieked one of the grunts. We looked outside and sure enough, the portal to hell was forming once again. All the pilot said was, "Brace yourself, we're going in." The nose of the aircraft tipped towards the vortex as the engine screamed bloody murder. We shot like a bullet towards the vortex and I closed my eyes. The shuddering stopped and we were in the calm once again. Jackson was speechless. "The energy spike must be creating a rip in space-time. It looks like hell," said Daniel, shuddering. "Can you control this thing?" I asked the pilots, who looked gloomily at me. "The controls aren't responding anymore." "We've lost contact with ground," said a grunt who was updating everybody back at base. At once, the mist started to form outside the plane and, as discussed earlier, the pilots eased it onto the red, rocky soil. We waited in silence until the mist intensified and the temperature dropped rapidly. No one was ready for what happened next. Of course, the thing appeared inside the plane. The thing didn't care about the rifles that were aimed at it. It just smiled, showing off those pointy teeth. "Oh, you came back," it said. "State your purpose," commanded Jackson forcefully. The thing looked at him. "Chris shall remain here. I need him." "Where is Kate?" At the mention of the word, something happened to the thing. Its featureless face changed into the sweet face of Kate, with its burning coal eyes turning into her deep blue eyes. I was at a loss for words. "Kate," I said, almost running to hug her. Daniel held out an arm, stopping me. "Oh, Chris, darling," said Kate, tears starting to form in her eyes. "You need to leave, please. This entity will take you too." "I can't leave you," I whispered. "The talisman," said John's voice. I looked at the usually emotionless guy and was shocked to see his face. He looked sad and almost looked like he was fighting back tears. This was the first time that I had seen him express any sort of emotion. "Gimme," said Kate. I could see that she was fighting to control her human body. "This thing feeds off humans, Chris. Every soul who comes to this dimension is doomed. Please give me the talisman. Free us all." I handed her the talisman with shaking fingers and screamed a cry of agony as she plunged it into her chest. John fainted on the floor of the plane, surprising Daniel. There was a guttural roar as the dark gray mist poured out of Kate's chest and the thing appeared, its eyes burning with hate. But the talisman had done its job. The thing faded into oblivion, but not before giving me a parting souvenir. As it tried to grab a hold of me, a smoky tentacle wrapped around me that felt like lava on my skin. Unsurprisingly, we tried to figure out a way to get back into our dimension, until Jackson had noticed that the portal was open. The pilots used the vector thruster engines to turn us around and we were back on Earth. Oh, and you want to know what that souvenir the thing gave me was, now don't you? I was proud of my skin, but contact with the thing in it had given me a grayish mark on my forearm, where the tentacle had made contact, almost like a brand. After getting debriefed and warned not to share my story with anyone, I wanted to find out what John's involvement was with this. I asked him just as he had dropped me off at my house. He looked at me like I was the dumbest person on earth. "Kate's my sister." No, before I forget, man, I was wondering if you could help me with something. The cashier, an acne-riddled kid who looked to be in his late teens or early 20s, looked up from shoving the bag of potato chips, 2 sodas, and a pack of Lucky Strikes into a plastic bag. For a moment, he just stood there, seemingly frozen in mid-action, and then he finally answered, "Yeah, what's up, man?" I let out a barely perceptible sigh. I had been half afraid that I would be told to take a long walk off a short pier, to put it politely. Feeling relieved, I reached into my back pocket for what was there. You see, I seem to have, sort of gotten lost out here. I decided to take a late-night drive and ended up getting turned around on all these two-lane back roads. I unfolded the map and set it on the counter so that he and I could both see it before continuing. So I was hoping that you could point out on here roughly where we are, and more importantly, the way to get back to the main road. There was another long stretch of silence, and then the kid began to laugh, softly at first and then louder. Dude, a paper map, he managed out between wheezes. Are you for real? What year do you think this is, 1993? For my part, I simply let out a resigned sigh. I had had a bad feeling that I would be getting this sort of reaction from someone his age, and it looked like I had been proven correct. Can't say I didn't see it coming. He wiped tears from the corners of his eyes and looked at me. Seriously, bro, don't you have a GPS in your car or something? He asked. Immediately, I hooked a thumb over my shoulder, pointing at the glass entry door at the beige sedan sitting at the gas pumps. Not in a Honda Accord from 1979, I replied simply. As he looked behind me out the door, I could see that he wanted to make another quip. Probably something about how I should buy a newer car or something. Thankfully, though, he kept it to himself. Instead, he leaned over the map and, still chuckling softly to himself, began looking at it. A few moments later, he snapped his fingers. Ha, I still got it, he said proudly, and then pushed his finger down near the middle of the map and looked up at me. We're right about here, roughly 6 or 7 miles outside of Placer. He leaned over the counter to see as he drew his finger away. Here? He nodded, and I pulled a pen out of my pocket, circling the area as a reminder once I left, and then examined the map further. Okay, so it seems that I could take more than a few roads to get back to Interstate 5, right? The kid nodded again, clearly already bored with the unusual interaction by the slightly annoyed look which had begun to cross his face. Sure, he said simply, and then placed my bag items on top of the map. And that'll be $14.50 for this and $28.50 for the gas. I reached into my pocket and pulled my wallet out, withdrawing 3 20s and handing them to him. The register let out its trademark ding as it shot open, and he placed the bills in it before pulling out and handing me my change. Placing it and my wallet back into my pocket, I picked up the bag and folded the map back up. Thanks for the help, I said as I turned to head out the door. Yeah, no problem. I heard him mutter at me as I crossed to the front door and pushed it open. A small bell hung from the inside handle jangled as I stepped outside and let the door swing shut behind me. The sounds of the refrigerators humming and the fluorescent lights softly buzzing was replaced by those of a summertime forest at night. Crickets and cicadas buzzed loudly in the grass around this door, almost overwhelming the buzzing sound of the lights over the palms. The sound of an owl hooting loudly echoed through the trees, followed by the loud call of what had to have been an owl. I inhaled the clean air before heading down the steps from my car. Pulling open the driver's door, I took one last look around before dropping into the driver's seat. So, did you find out where we are? Asked a voice from my passenger seat. For a split second, a wave of confusion and panic swept over me, and I spun in my seat. It was immediately replaced by a wave of embarrassment, amplified as my friend began to let out a deep laugh. Dude, were you in there that long that you forgot that I was out here waiting for you? Not wanting to admit that I had done just that, I shook my head. No bro, not that, just dealing with the kid in there was a major headache. He nodded sympathetically. And Craig was one of my close friends. Ever since we had met each other, we had immediately clicked, and had stuck with each other from that point on. And one thing that we both loved to do was take late-night drives to nowhere, simply driving around with no destination in mind, listening to the radio and occasionally sharing a joint one of us would buy. This was the first time that we had ever gotten lost, though. I reached into the bag, pulling out the bottle of Mr. Pibb and handing it to him. "Here," I said simply, before pulling the Lucky Strikes out and chucking the rest into the back seat. Pulling the key from my pocket, I slid it into the ignition and turned it. The car's buzzer sounding as the dash lights came on. A moment later, the inline four quietly rumbled to life with its traditional burble. Tearing open the packaging, I pulled a cigarette from the pack and stuck it into the corner of my mouth, before reaching to push in the car's cigarette lighter. As I did, I shot a glance back towards the store, and I froze. A small shiver shot down my spine as I realized the kid was standing at the door and staring out at us. What was he doing? Craig caught my gaze and turned to look himself. "Dude, what is his problem?" I shook my head as the lighter popped back out, signaling that it was ready to use. I pushed the glowing red coil against the tip of the smoke for a moment until it was lit, and then I placed it back into its slot. I pulled it from my lips and exhaled a cloud of smoke before answering, feeling more than a bit unnerved. "I don't know, man, but honestly, that's more than a bit creepy." I shot one last glance. The kid hadn't even blinked once. He was just staring off with an off-putting intensity out the glass. Come on, let's get out of here," Craig said, echoing the thoughts swimming through my mind. I put the car into first gear and eased off the clutch, the car beginning to roll forward. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him turn and shoot the bird at the kid as we slid out from under the lights into the dark. "Prick," I heard him mumble. I turned the car left and began heading back the way that we came. Well, the good thing is, yeah, I did find out where we are. I pulled the map from my pocket and handed it to my friend. I heard him fumbling for a moment and then a small flashlight clicked on as he aimed it at the map. "Dude, how did we make it almost as far east as Placer?" he asked with a slightly astonished tone. "A longer drive than normal, I guess," I answered, rolling down my window to flick the ashes from my smoke out. I shot a glance at the analog clock on the dashboard. 2:45, it read. I let out a small sigh. Great. Vanessa is likely worrying up a storm about us right now. And me especially. Ever since we had started dating 5 years ago, my girlfriend had always been rather apprehensive about my habit of taking long late-night drives when I couldn't sleep. She always feared that I would get into an accident either with another car, wrap my Honda around a tree, or hit an animal. Most of the time I would come home to find her sitting up and waiting for me, worry clearly etched into her beautiful sapphire eyes. I bit my lip slightly. "Hey, do you think I should text Vanessa and let her know that we're okay?" I asked Craig. I heard him let out a snort. "Honestly, bro, no. I know the woman loves you to death and I'm happy that you care so much, but she's got to learn you know what you're doing. Plus, you do need your space. It's not healthy how much time you two spend together." I flicked the remnants of the cigarette out the window and let out a snort of my own. "It's called being in love, dude. You should try it sometime," I joked, causing him to let out a laugh. "Nah, thanks. I enjoy being single too much." Shaking my head, I stared out the windshield as the headlights guided our way. I felt a slight sense of unease creep up on me as I watched the two-lane road stretch out before us. The moon in the sky almost completely blocked by the trees over our heads. I hadn't seen another car on the road for 2 hours at least. Well, what do you expect, Derek? You drove out into the boonies. There's only ghost towns out here. Why don't you try driving all the way to Idaho next time? Shaking my thoughts away, I fumbled in the center console for a moment before pulling out a mixtape. A bit of music would help me feel better. I pushed it into the car's cassette player and hit play. A moment later, the pounding bass and synths of Dance with the Dead's That House began blasting from the speakers. Craig let out a whoop of excitement. "Dude, yes! That's the kind of tunes we need for a drive like this." He rolled down the passenger window, sticking his head out the window to whoop and holler into the night. I shook my head, unable to keep from grinning at his antics. Friggin' goofball. The playful mood helped to settle my mind, and I felt myself relax into the seat, the tension flowing out of my body and out the window. For a few minutes, that's how things went, the road stretching out ahead of us and then disappearing into the blackness behind us, the music blasting off from the radio and the soft roar of the engine in the background. I shot another look at the backlit clock. Now it read at 5 minutes to 3, and we should be at the highway in a minute. The thought released the last wisps of tension in my body and fumbled into the back seat for the bag, catching it with the tips of my fingers. I pulled my bottle of soda from it and holding the bottle to the steering wheel, I cracked the cap. I lifted it to my lips and took a swig, taking my eyes off the road for a split second to tilt my head back. I looked back at the road and nearly spit it all out onto the windshield, and the second that I had stopped looking, a figure had stepped out onto the road. "Watch out!" Jamming my feet on the brake and clutch as hard as I could. The rear wheels of the car locked up and the ear-piercing sound of squealing tires filled the cabin. To my horror, the tail end of the car began sliding out. No, 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 no. For a few seconds, the world around us became a blur of shapes and colors, and I feared at any moment that we would smash into a tree or begin rolling. Thankfully, the car finally came to a stop with a screech of protest from the suspension. We were facing back the way that we had come. I could tell from the black lines in the road which had once been the rubber of my tires. I gripped the steering wheel with almost a death grip, my heart furiously pounding in my chest. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. There was no movement in the car for a few seconds before Craig reached forward and snapped the music off. "Dude, what was that?" he shouted at me, his face looking as pale as mine must be. I didn't say a word to him. Instead, I pulled up on the handbrake, ripped off my seatbelt, and practically kicked the door open. Stepping out onto the pavement, I stepped to the front of the car on unsteady legs until I was squarely in between the headlight beams. I looked around, first at the road ahead, then at the forest on either side. There was nothing there. What the? I turned and looked behind me over the roof of the car. The red glow of the taillights illuminated a few feet ahead, but beyond that, nothing but blackness. I turned again, looking out at the darkness beyond the branches. No movement disturbed the bushes and branches, and aside from the quiet hum of the car's engine, it was silent. I shook my head. Did I just imagine things? I shook it again. No, I know for a fact that I didn't hallucinate. There was someone there. The sound of the car door opening made me turn. Seeing Craig step out of the car, leaving the door open, he immediately came over to me. "You have exactly 20 seconds to explain to me what the heck just happened before I lose it, bro," he exclaimed. For a second, I fought to find my voice and then I answered. "Someone, dude, I'm not crazy. Somebody stepped out of the woods and onto the road. It looked like a chick. I thought that I was going to hit her." I realized that I had been holding in a breath and I let it out, trying desperately to get myself to relax. Craig gave me a confused look. "Are you serious, man?" I nodded. He pulled the flashlight that he had used to look at the map from his pocket and flicked it on, aiming it first at the tree line on one side of the road and then the other. After doing this a few times, he turned back to me. "Well, whoever it was, they're not there anymore." His brow furrowed. "But why would a chick be out here in the middle of nowhere?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. I still answered, "I don't know, man, it's freaking Josephine County. For as many good people live out here, there's also a bunch of weirdos." I heard my friend let out a snort of laughter in reply, but something had caught my attention. A feeling which had slammed into me with all the weight of a Peterbilt. The feeling of eyes boring into the back of my skull. I spun around, looking back towards the car and seeing nothing there. But the feeling remained and I didn't like it one bit. Especially when the feeling came again, this time from the direction that I had just been facing a moment ago. Realization dawned on me and I felt a shiver shoot up my spine, along with the flicker of fear. "Oh crap," I whispered. Craig turned to look at me. "What?" he asked, seeing the look on my face. He repeated, "What?" I looked up at him, speaking with a bit of a weak voice. "Let's get back in the car right now." He didn't argue, thankfully. He was already moving for the open passenger door, and I matched his pace as the feeling of being watched intensified, as if someone were rapidly approaching from the woods. I broke first into a run and then a full-out sprint for the last 10 feet, tearing at the door handle and practically launching myself into the driver's seat. Slamming the door closed behind me, I jammed down on the door lock, seeing Craig do the same. He turned to me, his face hidden in the dark, but his voice giving a perfect mental image of it. What the heck was that, man? The tone of it gave away the fact that he had felt, even for the briefest of moments, the same feeling of dread and fear that I had had. You remember those videos of people driving on empty roads in the middle of the night, only to have somebody step out into the road and get them to stop? I asked. A sharp intake of breath came from the passenger seat before he answered, finishing my thought. And then a bunch of people sprint out of the woods trying to ambush them. Oh, heck no. Yeah, my thoughts exactly. Time to get out of here. I released the parking brake, pulling on my seatbelt and jamming the car into first gear. The tires chirped as I hit the gas, and a moment later, we were accelerating away. As we did, the feeling of being watched rapidly fell away to nothing, and I allowed myself to let out a relieved sigh. We drove in silence for another few minutes before I finally spoke again. "I think we're in the clear, man." Craig let out a soft laugh. "Thank God for that." I nodded and then reached for the soda which had fallen, wedging itself by the parking brake. Snatching it up, I uncapped it and took another swig, the still cool liquid feeling amazing going down my throat. Recapping and dropping it behind me into the back seat, I let out a laugh of my own. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, Craig, but I think after this, I may take a bit of a break from late night drives for a while. This just got under my skin too much. For a few moments longer than I thought, there was nothing, and then he answered, "As much as that sucks, bro, I can understand. No problem at all." I thought that I could detect a small tone of sadness in his voice, along with something else that I couldn't place. But then I heard him sit up straight. "Hey Jake," he asked, a bit of a concerned tone now etched into it. "Yeah?" I heard him draw another breath. "Shouldn't we be on the highway by now? Or at least see the lights of passing cars?" I hadn't been fully concentrating on anything except the next stretch of road and my headlights. But at his words, I jerked my head to look beyond them. He was right. The lights of cars and trucks flashing by on the freeway should be visible through the dark. I clearly remembered looking in my side view mirror as we had turned onto the road from the highway, seeing the ever-present white and red glows zipping by both ways at close to the same distance that we were now. That wasn't the case anymore. All I could see in front of us was darkness in the woods on either side of the road. For a moment, I lifted my foot off the accelerator, letting the car slow down a little as my brain whirred. He's gotta be mistaken. I've gotta be mistaken. We just haven't gotten close enough yet to the highway. You know these old roads, Derek. They often end up longer than they first look. Feeling somewhat relieved by the thought, I said it out loud to Craig. He nodded, but I could tell that he wasn't completely convinced. And for that matter, as much as I repeated it mentally to myself, I couldn't completely convince myself either. It was as if seeing the woman step in the road had shaken me more than I had first thought. Pushing back down on the gas, I shifted into fourth gear and watched the speedometer flirt with 50 miles an hour. For a few minutes more, neither one of us saw anything as we drove in silence. And then Craig let out a cry. "There, a light." For a moment, a surge of hope welled up inside me, and I craned over the steering wheel looking to see the highway. It was dashed as I saw it was only a streetlight, standing solitary guard on the side of the road like a sentry. Beneath it stood an old worn sign which seemed to have been shot as many times with both BB pellets and actual bullets. I slowed the car some as it came towards us so I could read it, and I felt a wave of confusion fall over me. Golden, 2 miles. What? Craig breathed out as he read the sign. It passed by us, the streetlight momentarily bathing the interior of the car in light and showing the confused, worried look on his face. How did we end up by Golden? Golden is a ghost town, one which attracts visitors every year to check out these standing buildings. It was a mining town which had a population of a few hundred people, but once the prospects dried up in the early to mid-20th century, it became the ghost town that it is today. Its biggest claim to fame nowadays was being featured on Ghost Adventures a few years back. Craig repeated his question, but I wasn't able to answer them. My thoughts were racing inside my head. There's no freaking way. Golden is miles to the north of Placer. There are no roads connecting the two areas from what I saw on the map. Not to mention, we've been driving in a straight line since leaving the gas station. I honestly don't know, man. I finally answered, my voice conveying how rattled I truly was. In the car's dark interior, I saw him put his head in his hands. I fumbled for my pack of cigarettes, pulling another one out with slightly unsteady fingers and pushing in the cigarette lighter. A moment later, the turnoff for the ghost town flashed by on the right. I saw the dark, hulking shape of the church's spire, rising out of the dark for a moment. And then it was behind us. The lighter popped out and I pressed it to the smoke, lighting it and putting it back. I decided that I needed to try and calm the rising tension that was filling the car's interior. Look, however we ended up here, man, the fact is, we can't be far enough from the highway. So let's just keep our wits about us. Keep calm and then we get back to my place. You, me, and Vanessa can have a good laugh over this. Sound good? I heard my friend take a deep breath, and then let it out in a whoosh. Okay, yeah, that sounds like a plan. He let out a soft laugh and I felt him pat my shoulder. Thanks, Derek. You are seriously a good friend. I'm glad that I've got you. I nodded and then realized that he may not have been able to see it in the dark. No problem, man, I said. I looked at the clock. 3 a.m. Only 5 minutes had passed since I had last looked at it, and yet it felt like it had been more than 30. Time seems different when you're stressed. For a few minutes there was only darkness, and then a light appeared in the distance. Hey, there we go, I exclaimed. I waited to see the sign for the on-ramp appear, and I felt a shiver shoot up my spine as the sign for Golden flew by again. That's what? Craig didn't say anything, but I felt him stiffen in the passenger seat, showing that he had seen it as well. As the streetlight and sign disappeared behind us, a feeling began to creep up on me. Another shiver shot up my spine as I realized that it was the same feeling that I had had when we had gotten out of the car. The feeling of eyes on me. My eyes shifted to the blur of trees on either side of the car, but I saw no one there. The turnoff for the ghost town approached again. I heard Craig let out another deep breath. Derek, pull over please, he said simply. His voice was shaking, and as much as I didn't want to stop, I did as he asked, pulling over just before the turnoff. He ripped his seatbelt off, shoving the door open and stepping out. I watched him stride to the front of the car and stand there for a minute. He seemed to start shaking for a bit, and I realized just how much this was getting to him. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle when I glanced at the clock and froze. The clock was still showing 3 a.m. The hands hadn't moved at all. A feeling of shock washed over me like a wave as it tapped with my fingers to see if it was merely stuck, but it refused to begin moving again. Okay, what the actual heck is going on? I whispered to myself. I reached into my pocket, fishing out my phone and turning on the screen. Like the clock, it too showed the time as 3 a.m. The feeling of being watched began to intensify, and I glanced at Craig standing in the dark before looking down, beginning to type out a text to Vanessa. "Hey baby girl, just wanted to let you know that Craig and I are okay. We're trying to get back to the highway, but we've gotten a bit turned around out here. Do me a favor, and if I don't text you again in 15 minutes, text me back, okay? I love you." I replaced the phone in my pocket. I knew that I should have been more honest, but I was beginning to feel a little freaked out about the weird situation. I didn't want to worry her any more than necessary, as it would make me start to freak out worse. Pushing open the door, I got out and walked around, stopping near the front right headlight. "Dude, you alright?" I asked him after a moment. He didn't answer, but happily he seemed to have stopped shaking. I repeated my question. When he didn't answer my second and third calls, I began to feel the new sensation creep up on me, a potent mixture of dread and fear. "Craig, dude, you're creeping me out. Please say something." He finally turned to look at me, and in the semi-glow of the headlights, I saw that his face had gone a bit pale. He raised a finger and pointed, as saying only a single word. "Look." My eyes followed where he had gestured, and I began to feel like somebody had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. The cigarette dangling from my lips fell from my mouth to the ground. Standing about 50 feet away just inside the tree line was a figure. It was drenched in gloom, but with a gasp, I realized it was the same woman who had nearly caused me to wreck. "Oh, screw me sideways, man," I swallowed, finding my voice. We should get back in the car, Craig." He nodded almost immediately. "I think you might be right," he answered, his voice wavering. Not taking our eyes off the figure, we slowly backed up until we reached our respective doors and climbed in. I didn't even bother putting my seatbelt back on. I just jammed the gear shifter into first and I floored it. Dirt and gravel kicked out behind us and the car shot forward onto the road. This time I didn't let up on the gas. I kept my foot down hard, the engine beginning to roar as I shifted into third and fourth. The speedometer reached 60 as I shifted into fifth gear, the feeling of being watched intensifying with each passing second. I prayed that I would see something, anything ahead of us. An intersection, a house, a freaking out-of-use payphone. And then my blood turned to ice as a light appeared ahead of us, the exact same one as before with the sign underneath. My eyes flickered to the clock and terror shot through me as I saw it still was frozen at the same time. "This isn't good, bro," Craig said from the passenger seat. I agreed with him, but I didn't say it out loud. I kept my foot to the floor, the speedometer now hitting 80. The turnoff appeared again, and what I saw made me want to scream. The woman had gotten closer to the road, and she wasn't alone anymore. Behind her I saw others, the outlines of other people, dozens, possibly more. They all stood facing the road, watching us fly by, and then they disappeared into the rearview mirror. "Jesus!" I breathed out as the light and sign flashed by yet again. This time the mass of people had gotten even closer to the road. The woman stood in front of them all, and for a split second, the headlights illuminated her. Another flash of ice shot through my veins as I saw the river of blood pouring down the front of her nightgown, one that looked to be decades old. "What do we do?" Craig asked me, his voice steady, yet filled with fear, the same that I felt. I just shook my head. "I don't know, man," was all that I could say. The streetlight began to appear again when I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, causing me to nearly slam on the brakes in surprise. I fumbled in my pocket for it, seeing Craig look over at me. I texted Vanessa when we stopped. I told her to reply back in a few minutes. Now I think I'm gonna tell her to call the cops or something. He didn't reply, instead turning to look out the windshield at the approaching light. Flicking my eyes from the phone screen to the road and back, I forced myself to not look at the turnoff as we zoomed past the light. I didn't want to see how close those ghosts or demons or whatever they were had gotten to the road. I flipped my finger, pushing away the lock screen and tapping on the messenger icon as the light began to appear once more. Vanessa's message automatically opened, and for a moment relief like I had never felt surged through me at the small bit of normalcy that I had in my grasp. I froze. I didn't even look up at the road. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the single sentence, reading and rereading it. A wave of confusion passed over me, enough that I spoke aloud. "The heck?" Craig spoke up. "What? What did she say?" I didn't answer him. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour trying to understand, but it was like I was hitting a mental wall. I tried to think of something else as another thought came to me, but again the same block was coming to me. As it did, a new wave of fear began to rise up in me, one for an entirely new reason than the terrifying loop flying by outside. The speedometer now showed that we were doing 90, and then Craig spoke. "Can I ask you a question, man?" Ice filled every vein in my body, not at his question but at his voice. It was different. Gone was the fear and tension that he had had not even a minute ago. Now he just sounded flat. No, not flat. I couldn't tell why, but the way that his tone was, it almost made me feel like he was smiling. Another shiver cascaded up my spine as I finally forced myself to answer, my mouth dry as cotton. "What?" He answered as we began to fly under the streetlight. "Are you scared?" For whatever reason, the question made me turn to look at him, just as the light whizzed over us. For a split second, the car's interior became illuminated again, my eyes locked with his. The light flew by, the turnoff appeared again, and for a moment, my eyes flicked up to see that the woman was right next to the road, bathed completely in the headlights. I finally caught a glimpse of her face. And then I was screaming, my fingers tearing at the door handle as the car swerved to the right. I saw a tree flying towards the windshield. I didn't think. I just forced the door open and leapt out. The ground rapidly flew up to meet me. Darkness. I woke up in a hospital room, a bandage covering my head and one arm in a sling. My chest felt like it was on fire as well. The first thing that I saw was Vanessa, who upon seeing me wake up, burst into tears and wrapped her arm around me. A few moments later, the doctor came in. He told me that I was a lucky man. Apparently, I had gotten away with only a gash in my head requiring staples, severely bruised ribs and a broken arm. Shocking for having dove out of a car at what appeared to be tremendous speed, he said, raising an eyebrow. And then he told me the police wanted to speak to me. He showed them in and 2 officers entered, asking me many questions. I told them exactly what had happened, well, except for 2 small details anyways. They appeared to take my account seriously and promised to look into it. "We've had some reports similar to yours, sir." One of them answered tentatively, and then they told me how I had been found. How a father and a son who owned a gas station nearby had been out driving, and had come across first my destroyed Honda, which had wrapped itself around a tree and then some, and then lying unconscious in the grassy ditch, me. They didn't say who they had been, but I had a fair idea who they had been, at least the son anyways. That night was 3 months ago. I've been at home resting and healing this entire time, and it's given me plenty of time to think, plenty of time to process everything. I try not to think about that night, about any of it. I feel like I'll go insane if I do. Especially after the police told me that they found nobody else at the scene of the wreck, only the passenger door hanging open. But I've had to after receiving an email from an unknown address, one claiming to be the son, the kid that I saw in the gas station that night. He told me things that his father told me he had seen for years, that he didn't believe at all. until that night. When he looked out the door of my car, that's when he had frantically called his father. As I type this out, I feel myself beginning to violently shake. Remembering the woman's face, indeed a ghost, as it flashed in the headlights. The look of horror plastered there as she frantically waved at me to get my attention. The same look the others must have had, remembering turning to look at Craig as the light flickered over, and seeing the smile on his face. A smile wider than any human being's could possibly be, filled with shark-like teeth as black eyes stared hungrily at me. The same shark-like smile the kid told me he had been flashed as I pulled away. But mostly, I remember the single line of text that Vanessa sent me, what caused me to rack my brain, trying frantically to recall my friendship with the figure sitting opposite me, and horror filling me as I realized that I couldn't think of one single memory. What will keep me from ever taking late-night drives again? The 3 words that will remain burned into my memory forever. Darling, who's Craig? Video games were strange places to hide notes. I was sorting through my old collection of PS2 games, reminiscing on the classics, when a scrappy piece of paper slipped from my copy of Kingdom Hearts. It had been neatly sandwiched behind the game itself, frozen in time, a folded crease splitting it in half. The corners were chewed. Kingdom Hearts was my favorite game as a little kid. We couldn't afford the consoles my friends were playing at school, but a PlayStation 2 was good enough for me. I didn't recognize the handwriting clumsily written in bright green marker, but what I guessed was a preschooler. Siri, it's my turn to play. Give me the controller now, or I'm telling mommy, you're being a noodlehead. Noah. P.S. You have 5 seconds here, the bomb will explode. Cute. The note felt strange in my hands, familiar and also not. I don't know what it was about this piece of paper, but just holding it made me feel almost hollow. A suffocating feeling slamming into me like waves of ice water. Loneliness. Suddenly it felt like I was alone in the world and always had been. My bedroom was too small, closing in on me. I choked out several breaths to get a hold of myself, squeezing the paper between my fingers. Why did I feel like I knew this writing? I didn't just know it. It felt like a part of me had been cruelly torn away, a piece of me I didn't know existed. And seeing these childish squiggles brought it back. Letting the note slip through my fingers, I shuffled back on my bed, my stomach twisting. I didn't have a sibling, but that was definitely my name written in a stranger's writing. Sari, are you ready? Mom's voice came from downstairs. I had forgotten that I had gone upstairs to grab a pile of games to take to the thrift store. Without thinking, I scooped up the rest of the pile, leaving Kingdom Hearts and the note on the floor. I dumped them in my backpack, and before I could stop myself, I slipped the note into my jeans. There was probably an explanation. Mom had friends with kids, so it was probably some random kid that I'd been playing with. Was it normal to forget or suppress them though? I had memories of solo playing Kingdom Hearts. That thought in particular twisted my gut, and I felt nauseous all the way to the thrift store. I wasn't surprised when Mom insisted on milkshakes at the diner. She even got my favorite, double fudge brownie with extra whipped cream. But I wasn't stupid. I may have been easily blackmailed as a little kid with sweet treats. Now, however, I preferred cash. I knew what this talk was about. Thanksgiving dinner at Grandma's. Mom had been playing around the subject for a while now, casually mentioning it over dinner, or when I was half asleep, spooning cereal into my mouth before school. I wasn't quiet about my disdain for Grandma's house. Located in the middle of nowhere, my Grammy's house reminded me more of Dracula's castle. There were too many rooms to get lost in, doors that led down hallways that reminded me of The Shining, and everything was frozen in the mid-1900s. Mom offered to renovate the house, but apparently Grammy was comfortable living like she was reliving the Spanish flu. I wouldn't have hated it so much if her house of horrors was actually interesting, but I wasn't allowed to explore. I had to stay in the lounge and freeze to death while the adults got tipsy on cocktails, Grandma repeatedly asking me if I wanted more candy. The year before was painfully boring. Grammy refused to turn the heating on, expecting her tiny fireplace to actually generate heat around the house. I spent the whole time that year curled up in a chair playing on my Switch, which died halfway through dinner. I brought my charger, but none of the outlets were working, of course. Grammy didn't have a TV, only an ancient radio that didn't even have a touchscreen. She did have an ancient games console, but there was no TV to connect it to. Thanksgiving was for family get-togethers, but in the Eaton household, it was more of an adult thing. I had no doubt that Thanksgiving 2022 was going to be just as insufferable. I had been hoping to use the "I'm almost 18" excuse, but Mom was winning me over with surprise shakes. The shake was as sickly as I had remembered. I downed half of it, sure that I was going to projectile whipping cream everywhere. The diner was our special place. Even the booth was ours. Ever since I was a kid, it was always the second booth from the door. I sat by the window, Mom opposite me. I found my gaze wandering. The seat next to Mom felt too empty, like somebody was supposed to be sitting there. There was that feeling again, a loneliness that I didn't understand. It was always just me and Mom, so why were my eyes stinging? "Siri." Mom's voice tore me from my thoughts. I had been absently staring at the seat next to mine. I had a vague memory of being cramped up and squashed into the window. I looked up, downing the remnants of my milkshake to choke the question slowly taking form in the back of my throat. "Yes?" I swiped cream from my lips and fixed my mom with my best smile. "I'll come to Grandma's for Thanksgiving dinner." Mom's expression crumpled. "How?" "You conveniently bought me my favorite shake the day before Thanksgiving." I rolled my eyes when her lips broke out into a wide smile. It's not like I had a choice. Before she could burst from excitement, I pulled the note from my pocket and I smoothed it out in front of her. On one condition. I slurped up the last of my shake. Dangerous territory. I was going to bark if I kept downing the dregs of chocolate syrup sticking to the bottom of the glass. "Can you tell me who wrote this?" I don't think I had ever seen her go that pale before. Mom's expression crumpled. Her lips twitched, like she might speak before she pulled her mouth into a wide smile. Leaning forward, she plucked up the note like it was poisonous and stuffed it into her coat pocket. I opened my mouth to protest, but she was already speaking, at first hesitantly, like Mom was unsure of her words. "Siri," she cleared her throat, wrapping both hands around her mocha. "Do you remember Jane?" I shrugged, pulling my legs to my chest. Again, my gaze was wandering, like it was searching for something or someone. I rested my chin on my knees, trying to avoid eye contact with Mom. "Jane from Australia," I said. "Your Facebook friend?" Mom straightened up. "Jane," she said, her tone hardening, like I was supposed to remember someone who knew me as a baby. "You remember Jane. She lived down the block and made your favorite cupcakes." Her smile was too wide when she reached for my hand, entangling our fingers. "Red velvet cupcakes, Siri. You remember Jane." Mom's eyes were manic, lips stretched into a grin, like she was trying to convince not just me but also herself. To her credit though, there probably was a Jane. Mom had too many friends to count, so it made sense that this woman would slip through my memory. But still, I couldn't seem to tear my gaze from the seat next to her, my mind trying and failing to carve a figure out of nothing. I blinked. There was nobody there. So why was my subconscious telling me otherwise? I hadn't noticed until that moment, but both of us were playing a game that neither of us wanted to lose. I didn't believe her, and she knew that I wasn't buying it. Mom studied me like she could see right through me. I tore my gaze from the seat next to hers. "I don't like red velvet," I said, snapping out of it. Mom cocked her head. "Since when?" "Birth." She dismissed my words with an eye roll. "Anyway." I could see the mania alive in her eyes though, panic and paranoia tearing her apart from the inside. I should have backed off, but it was Mom's expression that sent shivers creeping down my spine. She wanted me to believe her words, each one slipping from her lips, dripping with desperation. She didn't just want me to believe them. Mom wanted to believe her own BS. "Well, Jane from down the block. Jane with the bad haircut, you know Jane." She bopped me on the head, still with that smile that was too wide. Mom had zero subtlety. She had a son who was the same age as you. His name. Mom cleared her throat, swiping at her eyes. She made it out like she was fixing her makeup, though I could have sworn that there were tears in her eyes. "His name was Noah." Mom pulled out the note and waved it in my face, though I noticed that she was gripping it a little too hard. She slapped it on the table like she was putting the final card down, almost breathless, her smile widening. Mom was winning the game. I could hear her triumph in every word. "You kids used to spend all day playing video games. Oh, Noah was a sweet child. He was always polite and stayed for dinner when his parents were at work." She swiped at her eyes again, her lip twitching like she was going to speak, but instead she stayed silent. Noah. The name felt right in my tongue like I knew it. Except why would I forget such a close childhood friend? "Noah," I said. "So that's who was writing me notes." "He was more literate than you," she chuckled. "Only a year older, and while you were struggling to write your name, Noah could write full sentences." Geez, I thought. Why didn't she just adopt this mysterious whiz kid and replace me? "Oh," I said, dropping my legs. She was waiting for me to ask questions. I could sense the cogs turning on her brain. "So, did we stop talking or something?" "Yes." She picked up the note, smoothing it down with her nails. "I believe you just simply drifted apart." "That doesn't make sense," I found myself saying. I snatched the note off of her before she could dispose of it. Why would he leave? Mom continued to sip coffee from a cup that I knew was empty, her gaze never really finding mine. Instead, she was looking everywhere else but at me. Mom stared outside at the darkening sky, streaks of orange and yellow illuminating the horizon. I couldn't help being in awe of my mother's beauty. The kids at school were convinced she was my older sister. I inherited her light blonde hair, though on my mother every strand was perfectly in place, haloing her face. The late afternoon sun illuminated her face free of flaws. She really was beautiful. I was like a Walmart version. "Oh, sorry, what was that, honey?" Her tone was soft, almost whimsical, her eyes following fall leaves dancing across the sidewalk outside. I followed where she was really looking. Mom was watching a family of 3 loading groceries into their car. The parents were struggling with bags while their kids, a boy and a girl, ran after each other, splashing through puddles. Mom watched them, a sadness in her eyes that I didn't understand. "Mom," I said with an edge to my tone. "What?" She took another dainty sip of coffee that wasn't real. I watched her drain her cup when we first sat down. "He left," I said louder. I prodded the note that caught her attention. Mom whipped around to face me once more, her expression hardening. This kid who was supposedly my best friend just stopped talking to me one day. Something in her face twisted and I knew not to push further. She stood up and grabbed her bag, gesturing for me to follow. Children, especially young children, will grow out of friendships, she said coldly. Noah grew up. You both did. It is a completely natural and normal thing to happen. I found myself nodding and following Mom out of the door, my chest clenching. I was paranoid watching the note in her clenched fist. I opened my mouth to ask her for it back. That little piece of paper was my only connection to a stranger in my life that had been torn away. Once we were outside and I was pulling my jacket around me, she was quick to rip it up and dropped it into a murky puddle. I felt something shatter inside of me, watching the note dissolve into nothing. Mom! I jumped forward to try and retrieve it, only for her to step in front of me. She was shaking. I noticed her hands balled into fists by her side. It's late, she said. Let's go home. My mom spoke in finality, and my arms drooped to my sides. My mother had a certain commanding tone that at times felt comforting, like she was dragging me back to reality. But in this case, Mom was plunging me deeper into oblivion. Reality felt further and further away despite feeling the crunch of my shoes on rough tarmac and the ice-cold wind whipping my hair back. Part of me wanted to try and rescue the note, though from my mother's expression hard, almost hollow, I bowed my head and followed her to the car. I felt breathless, like any counter words that I could come up with would be sucked away. I saw her eerie silence as a warning for me to drop it, and I did. I forgot about the note, spending my evening helping her make cupcakes for Grandma. I hugged her, wrapping my arms around her. It was better to admit defeat than walk on eggshells around her, especially on a holiday. Mom was the one who was more lenient with the rules after all. Previously, I wasn't even allowed electronics at Grandma's. And Grammy insisted on a traditional holiday dinner. Mom eventually let me bring my Switch on the condition that it would be turned off when we were eating. Thanksgiving arrived and we got up early for the long car ride to Grandma's. I usually napped for the majority of the journey, though it was too cold. Both car windows rolled down, wind slapping me in the face. Are we there yet? I joked. 10 minutes into our 4-hour journey. We weren't even on the highway yet. Mom cranked the radio up, her and Dad singing along to 90s music that I vaguely knew, and I leaned back and closed my eyes. Motion sickness was my worst nightmare, especially on a road trip. I tried to read books on my phone, but my stomach really did not like that. I gulped down some water and then a can of soda to settle my gut. Both of them made me feel worse, and by the time that we were on the highway, I was shuffling uncomfortably in my seat, well aware of my temperature slowly rising despite the ice-cold wind in my face. Usually when I feel sick, I look for something to occupy my mind so I don't bother my parents. But my phone signal was dead, and there was only a certain amount of times that I could scroll through my photos and an offline Spotify playlist before I started to go insane. My hands started wandering, first picking at the battered leather seat, and then delving in between them. I wasn't expecting to pinch something in what felt like a folded-up piece of card. I glanced at the front seat. Mom and Dad were reminiscing their anniversary, nodding along to a 90s ballad. I took the opportunity to pull the card out from under my seat. It was a folded-up piece of paper stuffed into half of a birthday card. There was a message written in smudged black pen. Unlike the notes that I had stupidly given to Mom, which she had destroyed, this one looked recent, maybe a few years old. I dare you to tell Mom Leonardo DiCaprio's son has died. Maybe she'll turn the car around and we won't have to go see the Wicked Witch of the West. Noah. Siri. Mom's voice was too close. I could see her slowly turning around to check up on me. I jumped into action, stuffing the new note between my legs. Yeah? Swallowing hard. I passed a smile on my face despite sour bile rising up my throat. My hands were shaking in my lap. Noah, my childhood friend, had somehow been inside our car, this time a teenage version. I clung onto the note as if she was going to rip it away from me again. Mom was lying to me. Noah wasn't a childhood friend. So who was he? Are you okay? Mom was frowning when I lifted my head. Sweetie, you look pale. Do you have car sickness? I couldn't help it. The words were in my mouth before I could swallow them down. I stuffed my hands down the seat once again, searching for more notes from this phantom stranger who wouldn't leave me alone, who was ripped from my every memory. My fingers did skim across something, though it wasn't a note. It was a pen. The same pen used to write the message, which meant this wasn't some little kid from when I was a preschooler. I didn't know when the pen had been used. It could have been the day before or 2 whole years before. And Dad never cleaned the car, so I was still finding McDonald's wrappers from 2020 stuffed in the back. Mom, I'm an only child, right? Her expression didn't waver this time. This again. I'm just asking. Of course you are, Siri. Mom twisted around in her seat. Is this about yesterday? She directed the conversation to Dad, though I couldn't help notice his fingers had tightened around the wheel. Siri found a note from one of the boys that she used to play with. You remember little Noah, right? Dad didn't reply for a moment, his gaze on the road. Mom lightly shoved him. Huh? His voice was gruff. Oh, yeah, Noah, I remember that kid. Dad laughed heartily. Sweetie, do you remember playing that game with him? Kingdom Hearts, I said through a breath. Yeah, the Disney one. You kids were obsessed. We tried to get you to play outside, but you insisted. One summer we had to physically drag you outside. I wasn't buying it. So, me and this kid were close. Yeah, but all you did was sit inside and write to yourself. You had quite the imagination, you even. Dad drifted off when Mom had nudged him again, harder. His sharp exhale of breath told me that her elbow had actually made a mark. I watched his fingers gripping at the wheel, white smudging his knuckles at the crease between his brows. Noah, he was a really great kid. Mom's smile made my stomach projectile into my throat. Her eyes were too wide, almost cartoon-like she was doing her utmost to sway my thoughts, planting seeds in my mind. See, now why on earth would you think that you're not an only child? It's always been you, Siri. We only wanted one child, and that was you. I wanted to find sincerity in her eyes, but all I could see was slowly blossoming paranoia, fear twitching between her brows. Her gaze was on my clenched fingers, like she could sense the note. Eventually, she gave up. You were our first. Mom leaned back in her seat. And our last. I noticed her eagle eyes flash to the car mirror. And what have you got there? Nothing. I shoved the note in my pocket when she averted her gaze. Mom had eyes in the back of her head. I was only curious, I said, shrinking in my seat. I was with my parents. I was safe. I should have felt safe. So why did I feel like I was being driven into darkness? An unsettling feeling came over me and it wouldn't leave me alone. Mom didn't look like my mother anymore, more of a faceless shadow in the front seat, while Dad was drowned out completely. The sun was too bright and I had a sudden overwhelming urge to jump out of the car. When Mom chuckled and changed the subject to her and Dad's jobs, I leaned my head back, squeezing my eyes shut, allowing the jerking movement of the car to calm me down. I had to concentrate. If I did have a sibling, why would I have forgot about them? And more so, why would my parents try to hide their existence? I didn't mean to actually fall asleep. I dreamed of trips to the diner with 3 shadowy faces that I couldn't make out, and Mom. And this time I was squashed against the window, though I felt comforted by the silhouette next to me. I shoved them and they shoved me back, snatching my straw from my drink. But the figure did not have a face, neither did the one opposite of me. They existed as carvings of figures, footprints in the snow. Mom, however, did have a face. Her lips were moving, but her voice was drowned out. She was talking to the shadow man next to me, and I could hear phantom laughter that sounded both real and not, a voice trying to force its way through the barrier in my mind. "Hey!" My voice was real, enveloping theirs. Mommy, I don't want." One figure lunged across the table, this time grabbing my shake and pretending to drink it. I tried to look through the shadow, but there was nothing. Even its voice sounded wrong, like faded ocean waves. I was just staring into pooling darkness, a deep dark cavern where something used to be. Another memory hit me. This time I was in the back of Dad's car. The windows were dark, the moon following me through the window, bobbing through illuminated clouds. "What did I tell you?" Mom's voice was loud. I was squashed between 2 figures again. Neither of them moved. "Siri, give me the pen." Mom's voice swam in and out of clarity. "Honestly, how old are you? I'm so tired of this. Give me the pen now." Already I could sense my younger self shoving the pen down in the crease of the seat. "What pen?" My voice was giggly. "I don't have a pen." Mom turned around so fast that I jumped back. For one fleeting moment, she did not have a face. "Give me." The shadow with the voice reached out its long, spindly arm. "The pen." I shook my head. "What? Noah has it." The car jolted, the reflection of the moon dancing across the window. I blinked rapidly. The shadow with Mom's voice turned back around, her voice breaking around the words. "Siri, I don't know how many times I have to tell you this, but Noah is not." Before I knew what was happening, I was waking up with my head against the window, an embarrassing amount of drool pooling down my chin. The door opened suddenly and I jerked properly awake, reaching for the note stuffed in my lap. Mom's hands were gently shaking me. "Hey sweetie, we're here." I could only respond through a grunt, jumping out of the car. My shoes landed in ankle-deep snow and I took a moment to groggily drink in my surroundings. It was lightly snowing, flakes dancing across my eyes and clinging to these strands of my hair. Grandma's house towered over us, a foreboding presence to it. There were no holiday lights or lights in general, so I had to use my phone flashlight, stumbling after my parents up the long, winding concrete steps and through the gate. And when we stepped through the door, I could see my breath in wisps of white. "Can we please turn on the heating?" I whispered, only for Mom and Dad to ignore me and head into the kitchen to greet Grandma, who was clanging around already making dinner. My grandma almost looked too good for her age. Her hair was held in a strict ponytail, and just like my mother, not a strand was out of place. I was desperate for her skincare routine, because when she saw us, her face lit up, and her made-up eyes brightened. Grandma was made of sunshine on the outside at least. She didn't look a day over 30, free of flaws, smooth perfect skin, and silky hair that I was envious of. I couldn't wait to grow up and to be ID'd past my prime. I stood at the door grateful for the warm golden light filling the darkness of the house. Mom pulled out food that she had made at home, and Dad made several unfunny dad jokes, popping champagne and offering to help Granny with the food. I waited for Grandma to suffocate me in hugs and throw sweet treats in my face, but she just continued talking to Mom about her job. After a while, I started to feel invisible. "I've applied to Berkeley, Grammy," I said out loud, only for her to speak right over me. Rude, but I figured she was excited to speak to my parents. and Dad made drinks, coffee for him and Mom and a sweet tea for Grandma. I headed over to the faucet to make my own, but he shut the cupboard before I could grab a glass. "Dad," I said, "can I get a drink of soda?" He didn't reply, laughing at the joke my mom made about his cooking. When I stepped in front of him and demanded a drink, his eyes didn't find me. Instead, drifting past, his lips latched to his own coffee mug. I stepped back and pasted a smile on my face. Being blatantly ignored stung, but I could play the same game. "Fine," I said, shooting Mom the stink eye. She continued, downing her wine, a smile splitting her lips. "I'll go entertain myself in the dining room." Usually the rule was for me to stay out of the dining room until dinner. I waited for them to come back to life, wanting me to stay out, but they kept talking, completely ignoring my announcement. So I strode past my mother, intentionally knocking into her. She almost dropped her champagne glass, her fingers tightening around the rim. I waited for her to start yelling at me, though her eyes skimmed right past me. "Mom," I said through a sharp breath. I thought it was a joke at first, some stupid joke between adults. Except this joke had been going on for too long. I situated myself in front of her, waving my arms. "Mom, why are you ignoring me?" It wasn't just ignorance. I quickly came to realize my family had pretended that I didn't exist. I sat down with them for dinner at my usual place. I noticed there were more plates than needed at the table, including one for me, which was ignored. There were only my parents and my grandma, but there were 8 sets of plates and silverware. A glass was set in front of me, but it wasn't filled. When I reached to fill my own plate, since Mom had seemingly forgotten my existence, the food was swiped from the table before I could wrap my hands around the potato salad. I tried to grab the gravy. Same thing. Dad reached for it for his own dinner, ignoring my protests. When my family were eating, laughing, and joking around, I sat back in my chair, frustrated tears stinging my eyes. I started to notice it in slight splinters at the corner of my eye. When I was glaring at my mother eating the last of the turkey and giggling over the rim of her glass, something next to me moved. A fork slid across the table, daintily jumping into the air and hovering for a moment before dropping onto the floor. Mom definitely heard the loud clang, pausing and sipping wine from her glass. Dad stopped chewing, but Grandma stayed perfectly still. Her plate was still filled, as was her glass. I took the opportunity to stand up, making myself known. I picked up my own glass and dropped it onto the ground. "What is going on?" I demanded over the sound of shattering on the floor. Mom flinched and a shiver crept down my spine, phantom bugs filling my mouth. "Mom, I know that you can see me." Before I could stop myself, I strode over to her and snatched her wine, throwing it at the wall. But Mom didn't even blink, though her gaze snapped to me for a fraction of a second, her hands trembling in midair as if still holding her drink, before dropping into her lap. Her reaction was enough to make me feel invisible. It was like a barrier stood between us. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. There was that feeling again, swamping me in cold ice water. Loneliness. I thought I didn't know or understand it, but the feeling of suffocating in my own bubble, cut off from the people around me, was familiar. I knew the feeling of being ignored, and it felt like a blunt knife being violently dragged down my spine. I slumped back into my seat when they continued talking. "I know you can see me." The lights above flickered, Mom flinching again. "They don't want to see us, noodlehead." The voice was both familiar and not, just like the note. Suddenly, it was as if a barrier I didn't know existed was pierced through. The voice slammed into me and I lifted my head. I exhaled and I could see my breath. The world continued around us, my parents talking and eating, while I found myself plunged into this unknown limbo between reality and something else entirely. The table was a lot fuller than I had remembered. The chair opposite me was occupied. a boy my age hiding behind a mess of blondish brown curls. Something acidic crept up my throat. There was something wrapped around him, frayed rope binding his arms to the chair, his body to the table. There wasn't just rope, there were chains, rusted and falling apart, pinning him to a seat. And glancing down, I saw shackles around his ankles, a loose chain running directly under the floor. This guy looked like he had been plucked directly from the past and yet also had the expression of a 21st century teenager. There were creases in his face that shouldn't exist, streaks of gray in his hair. His clothes, a jacket and jeans, were hanging off of him, a skeletal figure drained of all life. He looked both 17 and 70, playful eyes almost mimicking those of a child. I knew his voice, mocking his younger self. I knew his rolled eyes, his brow raising into his hairline. Noah. I felt like I couldn't breathe, the breath dragged from my lungs. My brother. 3 Thanksgivings ago, I was told not to look at him. I was told to ignore him. His ghostly voice hit me, a frightened cry. Siri, you can see me, right? Noah had slammed his hands on the table. Please, Siri, you know that I'm here. Look away, Siri, Mom had said calmly, ignoring his screams. And I did. And I forgot my own brother existed. It doesn't hurt. Another voice I knew, one that squeezed my heart. Sitting next to Noah, willowy blonde hair turned gray and lifeless, was my little sister, Alex. I had forgot her 4 Thanksgivings ago, forced to turn away from my wailing sister screaming to be acknowledged, while phantom rope turned to real rope, coiling around her arms and snaking across her neck. And presently, Alex's hand was skeletal when she lifted it to wave. I could see the ugly rinds of skin, rugged and ancient. My sister was a year younger than me, 12 when I forgot her, and presently 15. 15 with yellowed teeth, her eyes sunken. I had siblings. Next to my father was Annalise, my older cousin, skin and bones. Her smile, though, was still sweet. I had a vague memory of my cousin following me around, begging with me to look at her. But I stared at the ground. Mom told me to look at my food instead. Annalise's restraints were the oldest, her beautiful face haggard. You just don't remember it. I could feel myself moving back, a cry clawing at my throat. They were always there, shadows in the diner and squashed next to me in the car. How did I forget them? Mom! I knew she could hear me. I jumped up, only to be dragged back into my seat, phantom tendrils snaking around the back of my neck. I could sense them entwining around me, unearthly rope pinning me to the seat, and ghostly chains suffocating my screams. I choked on a shriek when the first layer of flesh was ripped from my arm, which was violently dragged behind me. A second layer and the pain was white hot, sending my thoughts into a whirlwind. Happy Thanksgiving. Mom spoke through a strained smile and lifted her glass. When I was watching streaks of red pulling down my arm and spotting my plate, the skin on the backs of my hands were starting to fold and wrinkle. Mom's smile was directed at Grammy on the other side of the table. With the barrier breaking through, clarity was starting to bleed through. I didn't remember Grammy not having eyes, her head bowed and shrouded in darkness, but I could hear her lips smacking together like she was eating. I called Alex, wincing, her lips forming a silent cry. Annalise squeezed her eyes shut, and Noah tipped his head back, lips parting. Grammy was eating them, gnawing on them like fresh meat, stripping their flesh straight from the bone, sucking the life from their faces. Annalise's cheeks were sinking and turning gaunt, and Mom tripped over her word when I felt the skin start to peel from my face. I could no longer feel pain, my body had become numb, but it wasn't a mercy. The more that I felt myself being stripped of my life, my mind, my thoughts started to turn to soup. I had to blink several times and remind myself of my name, but it was getting harder to string words together in my mouth. Happy 250th birthday, Mother. The lights flickered and Noah let out a breath. I'm sorry, he said, when that phantom tumor continued eating away through me, chewing through everything that I was. Grammy has to eat. I couldn't move my arms, they were already shackled down. My limbs were numb, unresponsive. Oh wait, Mom's voice was calm. She turned to my dad. Sweetie, could you go upstairs? This is new, Alex hummed, my brother agreeing with a low murmur. Dad's face turned ghostly white. But, he laughed, though it was choked. You said if we leave. I had never seen my dad look so scared. Mom didn't speak, but her expression was final. Dad's lip curled in disgust. He started to protest only to shut his mouth. Still though, he stood up and nodded, leaving the table. When he shut the door, Mom turned to Grammy. I didn't remember her not having eyes. She was still beautiful, youthful, and yet her eyes had been carved from her skull. With the barrier no longer there, I could see her for who she really was. Can I talk to my daughter, please? Mom asked the thing with Grammy's face. It nodded and slowly raised its hands to cover its eyes. Siri, Mom stood up slowly. She didn't move towards me or even look at me, but she did speak directly to me. Do not look at them, she said in a sharp breath. Don't touch them, don't speak their names or acknowledge them. Her gaze found each seat, Alex and then Noah and finally Annalise. Run, she said. There's an old phone box down the road. Tell them you need help and promise me you won't look back. When she lunged at me, part of me thought that she was going to attack me, except her trembling arms were going around my neck, squeezing me to her and then grasping for my restraints. Promise me, she spoke through sobs that racked her chest. Don't look at them, don't say their names, but when you realize what you've thrown away, you have to use it. Her smile was bright and beautiful despite her skin flaking away. It runs in the family, Siri, remember that. When the ground rumbled and the thing that was my grandma lowered her hands from her eyes, my mother squeezed me tighter. I knew exactly what she meant. She didn't want me to forget them. Mom wanted me to save her children. I did not cry or scream when my mother started to wither away, her skin peeling and then melting from her bones when I jumped up on unsteady feet, grasping for my sister's chains and choking out her name. I was pulling my sister from the chair when Mom dropped onto her knees in front of Grandma and begged for forgiveness. Alex was already pulling a shaking-looking Annalise to her feet and Grandma let out an unearthly cry. The more of my family that I was freeing, Mom was growing more haggard, her face sagging. My hands were on Noah's arms and pulling the ropes from his wrists when our mother dropped to the floor, crumbling into dust. Grandma stood up then, nothing but darkness hidden behind her pretty face. My hands were caught on Noah's wrist, struggling through a particular knot, when Grammy, whose hair turned white and then gray, opened her mouth, revealing razor-sharp teeth. Any day now, Noah hissed out. He twisted around. I'm going as fast as I can, I whispered. Siri, she's coming. I almost had it, but the knot binding his wrists together was stubborn. Grammy took a slow step, but just like Mom, she was starting to crumble. Noah jumped up, pulling the chain from his wrist. He was free, and Grammy, or what was left of her, was gone. With her, she took the suffocating darkness and looking around at my siblings, whatever she had stripped from them was slowly starting to creep back. Noah's cheeks brightened, he looked his age again, the gray streaks and wrinkled skin making way for exactly what she took from him. From all of them. Granny and my mother. I think my Grammy was a god of a different world. That's what Alex hypothesized anyway. She said the adults in our family held a ritual every Thanksgiving, sacrificing a child's existence and using us to stay young. I hugged my sister, squeezing her to my chest. Her youth came back slowly, bleeding into her facial features. And we found Dad in the bathroom, a pile of dust and a newspaper. I think he was reading it. Did he know that freeing the other kids would mean his death? How old were my mother and father, and how long had they been using kids to sustain youth? And Noah told me that there were more. They still existed in the dining room, bound to chairs forgotten and lost in that horrific purgatory between life and death. He said, once you yourself lose your own name as well as everybody else, you will fade into non-existence. This story or experience does not have a happy ending. They may have freed my family from my Grammy's clutches, but somehow, they still don't technically exist. They do to me and they always will. But when I opened the door and stepped out into the snowstorm, my mother's instructions running through my head, I could no longer see my sister. Looking next to me, my brother and cousin had faded into the snowfall too. I stepped back into the house and there they were. The house still holds them there. It had shackled their souls and it will not let them go. There are still kids to be freed, kids still lost, nameless and alone. Only when we find them and pull them from their chains will I be able to take my siblings back home with me. It's like a barrier. They still exist inside this house while the real world has forgotten them. Once either of them step over the threshold, I get scared that they will fade away completely. But still, it's not all bad. I'm not leaving them and I'm going to find those kids. We're spending Thanksgiving together this year and we're planning our own ritual. Playing Kingdom Hearts all day and binging on snacks. Noah used to be so smug that he could clear the island in like 10 minutes. Traverse Town was his favorite level. I've fully moved in and we're in the middle of renovating the house. I've managed to turn the outlets on. Grammy had them turned off and brought my laptop, as well as a bunch of things from storage that Mom and Dad threw away. Noah and Alex's things were stuffed deep into our garage, and we've been catching up on a lot. According to Annalise, our aunt had abandoned the family and her guilty of what she was doing. I'm currently researching the nameless god that feasts on children's existences. Noah found old records of an adoption in 2006. Mom's signature was on the paperwork. We have another brother. His name on the paperwork is Jordan, but so far Jordan is not working. He's here somewhere, I can sense him. Until I find our lost brother, I guess that I'll be staying here. It didn't take me long to regret being an only child. It's like living with children. Alex wears my clothes and Noah keeps trying to take over my research. Annalise is taking the role of house mom. I hate that they constantly leave a mess and blame me for being too boring. Alex's voice drives me crazy and Noah definitely thinks that he's the smart sibling. But at least I'm not lonely anymore. I'm not going to tell them this because they'll freak out, but I'm pretty sure that Grammy is across from me right now. She's sitting at her place at the table, and Grammy's smiling. Her rotten teeth are pulled into an ugly grin, her melted face stretched and disfigured. Skeletal figures tap on the table, waiting for me to face my cruel reality. Mom wasn't lying when she said that I was her only child. I found a gray streak in my hair this morning, and part of me, the poisonous part of me, knows exactly how to get rid of it. For those involved in dealing with cryptids, if any of you are reading this, why do you do it? Other than the money, of course, I feel a lot of you do it for the rush, the adrenaline. But where is the line drawn? Where does exhilaration evolve into panic? Don't get me wrong, a little risk-taking is food for the soul, but so many factors can go wrong in any situation. In particular, what do you do when you find the corpse of a cryptid that you were hunting, eviscerated and dismembered? When the abrupt realization hits you that there's a bigger fish. My grandpa wasn't quite on the level of monster hunting, but boy was he a crazy son of a gun. Once he hunted a grizzly using nothing but a crossbow, wet mud and leaves, and his wit. He's had its head mounted above his forest house fireplace ever since. I can't say how far back his love for the wilderness is rooted. but I know that he grew tired of the city long before retiring from his job as a metropolitan engineer. Since then, he's lived out in an old house in the northwestern reaches of the Olympic National Forest, about 40 miles from the park itself, Washington State. I can only imagine how lonely it must have been living out there by himself, but he never seemed any the worse for it. In recent years, I have come to be good friends with a guy that I met in college, Martin. I could see the same fire in his eyes as my grandpa's when it came to the outdoors, always pestering me to come with on camping trips, going fishing, hunting, you name it. It was a no-brainer bringing him along for a visit to my grandpa's. Honestly, I feared that they might get along too well, and Martin would never return with me. In the end, it didn't matter because both of us had been ingrained with a morbid aversion to the woods since that day. Martin was particularly eager this time, practically vibrating in the passenger of my Jeep. Last trip, Grandpa promised that he would show him the ropes of skinning and pelts. Martin often went on about how he'd feel sitting in front of a roaring fireplace with a great deerskin rug laid out beneath it. My motivation was simply to check up on my grandpa. He hadn't been responding to my attempts at contacting him for the past week, so naturally I was a bit worried. And we ran into a problem early, driving up the long dirt road to my grandpa's. Rounding a corner, I slammed on the brakes, seeing a slew of fallen trees lying across the road. "Dang, what happened here?" Martin exclaimed. "There haven't been any storms recently, right?" I sat with my hands, 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, lost for words. No, it's been pretty clear weather around these parts since March. Weird. Shutting the engine off, I hopped out of the Jeep. The only sounds were the leaves, filtering in the mid-spring breeze, nature's white noise. We were a little over 2 miles away from the house in easily walkable distance. Grandpa had enough equipment that we didn't need to bring much of our own, so our bags were light. I had my phone, a flashlight, water, spare clothes, and my utility watch strapped around my wrist. My plan was to get up to Grandpa's and come back down in his truck to chop up the fallen logs with a chainsaw. We thought that it would be more fun to go through the woods alongside the track. A long dirt road means only boredom after all. We scrambled down the left side slope and began our trek, keeping an eye on the road to follow its route. Only a few minutes later, the smell hit us. Putrid carrion. It was nothing unexpected. Animals in the forest die all the time. Even so, that hardwired part of my brain was repulsed at the smell. "Something's festering out here," I said. "Can't imagine how it would smell in the summer." Martin let out a small retch, but agreed. The stench only grew stronger as we went on. It was at its peak when I almost tripped over a sharp object in the ground. I thought it to be a cluster of branches at first, but the notion quickly dissolved upon seeing their pale ceramic reflections. A decapitated stag's head lay right in front of us. It was wrong though. The teeth were too long and the bone of its face was exposed. Even with the odor, I could tell that it was fresh from the viscous black blood that seeped from its neck and mouth. Martin spoke up. "That's freaky. You think a bear did this?" "I mean, there's only black bears here, right? I doubt they could pull off something like this. A cougar, maybe, I don't know. Never seen one straight up decapitate a stag like this, though." My eyes were drawn to a trail of blood forming a jagged streak ahead of us on the ground. My gaze followed it until it terminated at the stag's grisly mess of a body. Well, it looked quadrupedal from a distance, but as we moved closer, I found myself sorely incorrect. The body was that of a monster, large in stature but bony and gaunt. Long razor-sharp claws lying splayed across the ground like kitchen knives, and all covered in patches of dark, wizened fur. "Is it bad?" Martin called out. approaching from behind me to get a look. When he saw it, he went still and quiet as I had. There was no statement that could do the sight justice. I had heard the old tales of the horrors lurking deep inside the forest, but never experienced them face to face. It was still laying dead as the fallen leaves beneath it. It looked crushed and broken, littered with what seemed to be wide and deep puncture wounds. Martin managed to speak up. "Is that?" But before he could say any more, a sudden snap broke the tension. The snap of a twig, no, a branch. My spine shot straight upright. Against my better judgment, I found my head gradually swiveling in the direction the noise had come from. When I caught a vast, hulking shape in my peripheral, I whipped around to face whatever was there. I saw something just for a moment. Enormous long limbs draped in shaggy hair, the color of pine bark. But as quickly as I had turned, the image had vanished. Rising dread threatened to pry my lips apart in a scream. I looked far and wide, but nothing was there. "Kel, what is it? Wait, the cougar isn't still here, is it?" Martin whispered. "No, it's nothing. Let's keep going, we can talk about this later with my grandpa." "But the cat could still be loitering around somewhere. It's best that we don't stay in the same place for too long." Before departing, I snapped a few pictures of the mangled corpse on my phone, zooming in on the head without backtracking to get a better angle. Something told me that turning back, however briefly, would be a terrible mistake. We went on with urgent pace, pretending to ignore the heavy movements between the trees nearby. Large animals will inevitably give away their movements, but they snap twigs and not entire branches. Even so, the movements sounded anything but clumsy. No, they sounded calculated, those of a stalking predator. As hard as I tried to filter them out, I caught myself glancing to the sides and behind very often. I don't know whether I was hoping to see something or nothing. Still, the woods around us were empty other than ourselves. "Hey Cal, if there's a mountain lion around here, we should go up onto the road for a bit. It'll be easier to bolt if we need to." I agreed, and we veered off to the right, climbing up the roadside slope. Deep down I knew that whatever was out there, it wasn't a big cat. We only told ourselves that, skirting the subject of monsters now made very real to us. The forest fell silent as we walked along the road. That was far from being comforting though. If the woods are quiet, predators are about. It's a well-known idea in the community of wilderness enthusiasts. What did ease my mind to a degree was the sight of a herd of deer standing in the track. They cocked their heads to look at us but didn't seem all too disturbed by our presence. At the same time, a feeling of being exposed, vulnerable, grew as a hard lump in my gut. They started to move on as we got closer, wandering off the road and into the woods. One of the deer stayed in place. It wasn't frozen, no, but constricted. It twitched and whimpered as it started to rise off of the ground, as if weightless. It happened so quickly. Its screams were cut off as its limbs were snapped and crushed, and deep wounds erupted over its body. And then, like it had been there the whole time, it stood. It was a nightmare, huge, unimaginably so, rivaling two elephants stacked up. It was hunched over, resting on impossibly long and thick forelimbs ending in spindly, sloth-like claws. Its body was long too, ending in a pair of shorter legs, knees inverted with feet supported by spur-like appendages. The lolling head that sat atop an arched neck looked like some bizarre cross between a horse and a crocodile. Hollow pits in place of eyes, the torn skin around its mouth revealing horribly uneven and misshapen teeth that jutted out at irregular angles. The fading sunlight glinted off of the long gashes covering its sides and head. The dead creature from earlier had definitely put up a fight, but it could never have been enough. As we stood, stunned, it reciprocated our stare, the only real movements being the sets of rib-like appendages undulating on its underside, rendering the deer into a torn sack of flesh and bone fragments. The poor animal seemed to wither before our eyes as these sharp ribs forced deeper into its body, like a juice box having the last drop sucked out of it. In that moment, we were a part of the herd, paralyzed. Some had already run off, but others were as statues in the presence of this beast. Another smell hit us then, different from the stench of decay like earlier, but equally as sickening. Like moist earth, sulfur, methane, and dead fish. Its source was clear, as gas from the beast's mouth became thick, billowing fumes rising into the evening sky. The tension was broken with the deer's mutilated husk thudding to the ground. The remaining deer took flight, scampering off into the trees, and in response, the beast snapped its head in their direction. Something was wrong with its head, flopping around clumsily as it turned. I took a step back as it let out a deep and guttural rattle, before bounding off after the herd, its matted hair swinging violently. It splintered a tree as it went, but was totally unfazed by the impact. We waited until its thundering gallops faded into the quickly darkening night before saying anything. What the heck was that thing? Martin sputtered, tears welling up in his eyes. I don't know, man, but we have to get to the house before sundown. I have a feeling our chances at escaping it are little to none in the dark. Are you crazy? We have to go back. I want to get as far away from this place as. What about my grandpa? We can't just leave him here with that thing. Martin didn't look over to me, but wasted no time disagreeing, starting his jog up the road. We were already halfway to my grandpa's house, and even if we wanted to escape, it would be a menial task for the creature to smash the Jeep off-road. The solitary light in the distance looked like the gates of heaven. It radiated safety, but I knew that we couldn't continue out in the open completely exposed. I looked down to my utility watch, making a mental note of the direction of the house, north-northeast, before grabbing Martin by the arm and leading him off the left side of the road. Nature's cruel irony manifested in the steepening terrain and the thickening brush. The house's light quickly faded, leaving us with only our bearings to navigate. I thought that we might have gone off track for a terrifying moment, but I saw the column of smoke above the distant tree canopy that could only be from my grandpa's chimney. Come on, this way. As we neared, no light became apparent. Maybe he had already gone to bed. I could only guess with his lack of communication. We came up onto the lip of a hill sloping down towards a flat clearing, but there was no house. There, the pillar of smoke, but there was no source. It began in midair from nothing. As we stopped to look, the point where the smoke came from jerked around in the air. When I picked up on the organic stench, it clicked in my mind. Just like before, there it was, looking directly at us, the thick fumes spewing from its mouth. But I noticed something else this time. Now that the moon hung in the sky, its light glinted off of something beneath the creature's head. 6 black orbs, shiny like obsidian, 3 on either side of its neck. They darted about, independent of each other, and I knew immediately what they were. Eyes. What kind of abomination was this? If those were its eyes and it ate the deer with that structure resembling a ribcage, then that must mean that it had a false head, a distraction, defense mechanism maybe. It made sense how this head flopped around limply with the beast's unnatural movements. I blinked in quick succession, and I looked down to my watch. Due east. We had been misled. It had circled around us to lie in wait. In one motion, I gripped onto Martin's shoulder and pulled him in the direction that we were meant to be heading in a wild sprint for survival. The beast erupted into movement, ribs rippling as it let out another rumbling trill. Martin looked over to me confused. Hey dude, what are you doing? There's nothing to... Shut up and just run as fast as you can. Now don't stop for anything. Our pounding feet were matched by heavy thumps and loud cracks of trees being smashed. I dared not steal a glance behind, fearing that even the slightest break in pace would mean death. There! I struggled to see what Martin was talking about, until the yellow light became visible between the tree trunks. We were only a few hundred yards away, but I was surprised the creature hadn't already caught up to us. Even the trees in its way stood no chance at impeding it. It had almost caught up. I could feel the air pressure from its massive body charging through the trees behind, close enough that at any moment I might feel its claws cleave my body into pieces. A saving grace. Coming up on our left was a dense patch of old oak trees. I swerved towards them, leaping through the spaces between trunks, just large enough for us to get through. I hit the ground, rolling sideways. There wasn't even time to be dazed as an immense slam sounded from where we had just been. I scrambled backwards, looking to see a great arm slinking through the gap. It was thick, but not as thick as the oaks. The claws tapped about, searching blindly for our frail bodies. "Go!" I shouted, and the both of us shot to our feet and bolted towards the light. As we ran, the sounds grew distant. Was it stunned, or did it still think that we were behind those trees? I didn't care. All that mattered was being inside and not out. Gravel clattered against the front of the house as we skidded to a stop. I rapped on the door, devolving into pounding when they went unheard. On what was probably the 20th knock, my fist met only air, and I stumbled in through the now open doorway. I looked up to meet Grandpa's gaze. His eyes were wild. He didn't look like himself. He glanced behind me at Martin and then behind him. Whatever he saw out there, his pupils contracted in response. "Hurry, boys, get inside," he whisper-shouted. We filed in and he went to bolt the door but hesitated. His hand fell limply. No use. He was right. If the beast wanted to pay a visit, it would do so regardless of our home security. We followed him quietly to an uncovered floor hatch. "What's this, Mr. Barnett?" Martin asked, regarding the hatch. "Huh? Oh, this here's my old wine cellar." Martin went to ask further questions before being interrupted. Get down the ladder first, son. You can shoot your questions once we're safe." He pulled on a handle, opening the hatch to reveal a sturdy wooden ladder that led into a dim space beneath. One by one, we clambered down its dusty rungs, meeting the cold concrete floor at the bottom. Grandpa was last, tugging a heavy rug over the open hatch, before closing and securing it. "I take it you've seen the thing, right?" "Jesus, Granddad, we barely got away," I said, still out of breath from our escape. "Unscathed?" "Yeah, mostly, other than some scratches." "Good." He walked over to an upturned crate and plopped down onto it. Martin and I looked between each other and then back at him. Well, Martin said. "You seem to know what we're dealing with, so what is it?" Grandpa gave Martin a scowl of disapproval, quickly relenting into understanding. "I would scrutinize you on your manners, boy, but now ain't the time." He released a tired gasp, letting his head drop down before inhaling sharply and looking back up at us. "I've seen it only once before in my varsity years. Had some Danish friends on my course who said that I should come and visit them over there, go and do some backpacking in their home country. Beautiful landscapes over in Denmark, really. Peaks rising out of the trees, you know." Before he could lose himself in a daydream, I cleared my throat to bring him back to reality. "Oh, right. So we were pretty deep in the woods when it happened. We had all gotten paranoid because we thought something was following us. Something big, an elk maybe. But we never saw nothing, only heard it. And then God, one of the girls in front of me started to, levitate. I don't know, she was rising up off the ground, gripped by something. Whatever it was, it made a mess from her. Crunched her up like a meatball being squeezed. And I saw it then. curved bones wrapped around her, stabbing in deep. I ain't never gonna forget the sight of it. It's like a stain on my mind. We saw the same thing, Martin piped up. Only it was a deer. It looked like it sucked everything out of it when it was done. Yeah, I can't say I know how it works. You can only see it if you know something's there, if it's there. Anyway, we ran as fast as we could back down the trail and we had seemed to lose it. The whole time there was this rancid stink though, eggy and earthy. We wound up back in the town that we had started from, went straight to the police station and reported it. Apparently all they found was a little chunk of meat, a piece of thigh or something like that. One of the other guys told me about the tale later on. He brought up the smoke that we saw rising out of the forest when we were back in the town. An old Danish legend went that people through history seen smoke columns in the woods, and most of them who went to check never returned. They said it would move around, not like how a fire would spread, but like it was wandering to and fro. That's a horrible story, Grandpa, I said. It doesn't help us figure out what it is, though. We already know the stuff that you've just told us. Well, I'm sure it's got many names, seeing how it can just pop up where it likes. But I only ever heard it called the Skorstender. It means chimney beast if I'm remembering it right. That makes sense. We thought that we were seeing the smoke from your chimney, but it led us right to it. Kel, Grandpa sighed. This house ain't even got a chimney. Martin looked over to me scoffing and then back over to Grandpa. So it lures people in like that? Sure, but I don't think it means to. I'm gonna take a gander and say it started up with the fumes after it ate that deer. Yeah, I replied. Whatever that thing is, it ain't from here. It ain't from anywhere on the planet, I think. It eats something and then it starts giving off smoke. Waste product from digesting, I would guess. So, poop gas, Martin chuckled. He always was able to find a way to lighten the mood in dire situations, even if just a little. I looked up at the monochrome ceiling above us, mulling over what Grandpa had said. I remembered how this whole thing had started, and I pulled out my phone to bring up my photos. We found this after starting our way up to yours on foot. I have an inkling, but do you know what it is? Grandpa squinted at the screen and then took it from my hand. Scroll to the right, that's only the head, I said. His silent focus was only punctured by the dull taps of his finger on the screen. Recognition lit up in his eyes, his head bobbing up and down. Well, I'll be... Wendigo, right? I asked. Yup. I gotta say, never seen one around these parts before, but then again, I was never looking for one. I doubt you need it, but keep that as a reminder for what this beast is capable of. I put my phone back in my pocket, sighing and letting my chin drop into my hands. In any other situation, I'd be shocked to find out such a creature was real. But not now. This is all great, Mr. Barnett, Martin said with quivering uncertainty. But it doesn't help us. What are we gonna do? I mean, what can we do? I don't know. Well, I have a stupid idea, but it's only grasping at straws. Anything over sitting here and waiting to die? Martin breathed, staring off into space. Anything. Grandpa looked toward the basement window, the only source of natural light in the room. What little of it remained. Well, I was checking my traps out east from here about 600 and 700 yards into the woods. Only when I got there, there was this smudge. I don't know what to call it, but that's the best I can describe what it looked like. It was like looking into it. I couldn't register what I was looking at. It hurt my eyes after a while. Never seen nothing like it. It was after I had started seeing the Skorstender, so... He trailed off, like he was struggling to find the words to say. So what? I pressed, leaning forward in anticipation. Again, this is guesswork, but I think that's where it came out from. I threw a rock into it when I was there, but I ain't hear it hit the ground. It was like it went someplace else. If we can just lead it back there, just get it to go back in." "Wait, hold on," I interrupted. "I mean, shouldn't we call someone, police, the army?" "What do you think will happen to the cops when they come out here, huh? What's a chief and a rookie in one police car gonna be able to put up against it? And good luck convincing US military to send out Marines. You'd be lucky if they thought it was a joke." I shut my mouth, swallowing my next words, allowing Grandpa to continue with his proposition. "Either the beast leaves or we die. I'm not even gonna talk about trying to drive away. You've seen what it does to the trees. Stealth might work, but it's better at that than we are, as big as it is. And I don't want to risk either of yous losing your lives." His last remark sent a chill down my spine. He had said nothing explicitly, but I had already began to understand what he meant. "Granddad, you." "Oh, don't worry about me, champ. I got something, but you gotta listen closely, both of you." Martin and I set our full attention on him. I wanted to hear his plan, but I really hoped it was going to go a different way from what I was thinking. "Now I want to make this clear before anything else. I'm going alone and you boys need to sit tight and do as I say." My heart dropped, plunging into the stone-cold sea of despair. "Are you crazy? No, I have to go with you, Grandpa cut me off, shushing me. "As I say," he commanded. I knew that he was right, but in the face of loss, my thoughts wrestled against the idea. "Okay, now I'm gonna call you when I'm a ways off, alright? You have to pick up and stay on the call with me. It's vital that you keep your attention on my voice. I need both of you to be brave for the next part. I need you to make as much noise as you can." Martin's eyes bulged in fear. "Won't that just get us killed?" "I haven't finished. That's only up until I call you. When I do, you shut up and you hide in the darkest corners of this cellar, okay?" I was heaving for breath now, cold beads of sweat budding on my forehead, but I closed my eyes and stilled myself. "Yeah, okay." "Now good. Once we're connected, I'll start." We were silenced by a single muffled thump from overhead, so forceful that the ceiling spewed cement dust down on us. Then another thump and another and another. I fell off my perch in shock when a booming crash sounded from above, chased by the clattering of rubble. The steady thuds drew nearer, louder, until the only sound was that of the floorboards, groaning under immense weight. I looked over to Grandpa, who looked over to me and whipped a finger to his lips. I nodded and then slowly turned towards the basement hatch. The beast was trying its best to move silently. A stifled whimper escaped my lungs as I saw the hatch buckle. A loud bang shook the house's foundation, and then nothing. In the silence, I could make out the beast's ticking growl. It was toying with us, trying to catch us out, make us think that we had been foiled so we would burst out in a panic and try to flee. Its intelligence terrified me so much more than its grotesque appearance. It tried this bait a few more times before huffing angrily. The heavy creaks grew distant until we could no longer hear it, aside from the single crash of a fallen tree somewhere outside. I stood up, eager to set this plan into motion, only to be dragged back down by a firm grip on my arms. My eyes fell to meet my grandpa's, looking at me with a wide-eyed scowl. "Sit down," he hissed. "Not yet, the thing's clever. It's probably waiting at the tree line watching for us to come out." The three of us sat in silence, ears attuned for even the slightest noise to indicate its presence. After an excruciating wait, Grandpa rose to his feet and crept over to the ladder. He scaled it, wincing at the creak of a rung, and then pushed open the hatch ever so slowly. The rug that had been above us was tattered, torn fragments slipping down into the now open space. He peeked out from side to side, checking rigorously that we were safe. As he pressed his hand upward, What sounded like a broken tile was disturbed, clattering to the floor above us. Grandpa froze in place, visibly tensing. There was a heavy step, followed by a guttural rattle that I prayed to God I wouldn't hear forced Grandpa into action. He pushed himself off of the ladder, tucking and rolling to the floor, right before the hatch was slammed by immense force, cracking it and warping the hinges. Grandpa shot to his feet, adrenaline far outpacing his old age. He glanced around wildly at the floor, before looking up at us with a newfound determination. Change of plans. Martin, distracted, to make some noise. Cal, give me a leg up to the window. Martin's jaw fell open and his breathing quickened. Oh God, he yelped, pressing fingers into his temples. But to his credit, he turned toward the hatch and started up a racket straight after. Come and get it. I'm right here, you idiot. While Martin was busy yelling at the chimney beast, Grandpa and I hurried over to the window and braced myself in a kneel, fingers locked together forming a foothold, where he planted a foot. 1, 2, 3. I heaped him up, holding my posture while he unlatched and swung the window open. My body was already tired from running away, and Grandpa was heavier than he looked. But still, I hauled him up further until he was out past the waist, and he pulled himself out into the hazy night. I kept my focus on him as he turned around, refusing the urge to look as I heard claws cleaving away ravenously. All right, I'll be calling in a minute, he panted. And when I do, tell Martin to zip. I love you, bud. You too, Granddad. My words latched onto him, fueling a forgotten instinct that slammed his heels into the forest floor and sent him sprinting into the trees, fading until he was merged with the darkness itself. I was grounded again when Martin let out a shriek, and I turned to see him backpedaling from those spindly claws extending through the jagged hole that was once the hatch. A thick trail of blood smeared from him as he shuffled back, the same crimson that slicked one of the titanic claws. It got me, God, it hurts, he cried, flipping over and resorting to a belly crawl towards me. I rushed over and dragged him as far away as I could, but he flopped to the floor in shock when I released my grip. His calf was a mess of exposed and glistening flesh and bone, sliced through like warm butter. His mouth hung half open but without a sound, so I rushed to build a cacophony in his place. As booming as I tried to make myself sound, I devolved into whimpering shouts. The beast's arm had reached almost halfway across the room, yet still it slithered further and further through the broken hatch, claws ticking around in search of our flesh. Backed up into the furthest corner alongside Martin, the monstrous hand grew closer, slowly, agonizingly so. I only became aware of the incoming call from the vibration in my jacket pocket. It felt as if somehow safety lay in the act of answering my grandpa's call. My hand shot into my pocket and yanked the phone out, fumbling with the touchscreen and picking it up. Granddad, it's so close it's about to get us. Do something, please. I wailed into my phone. Instead of a reply, a loud crack rang through the night and then the phone. The beast's arm lurched backwards, freezing for a moment, before it tore out from the basement, peppering the floor with wood fragments. As simple a sound it was, I recognized it. His Black Hawk. He had taken it with him. I don't know when he picked it up, he may have had it on him the entire time. Out the window I saw the hulking silhouette barrel into the trees at speeds rivaling my Jeep in fifth. I jumped when I heard Grandpa abruptly begin shouting over the call. The words were indiscernible, blending in with the scuffed sounds of movement. I took the moment to take off my jacket, and then my t-shirt, which I pulled tightly around Martin's upper calf as a tourniquet.
Hey, Cal.
Grandpa said over the phone, sounding hollow and tinny.
Make sure that you keep up with your aerobics. God, don't get easier with it over the years.
I let out a half-hearted chuckle. I will. I want to go hiking through these woods with you, camping, surviving off of the hunt.
I know you do. My God, I do too,
he said, stifling a sob.
You're gonna have to stay strong for your ma, okay? There ain't no chance I'm getting out this time. But you two are.
I broke down then, thick watery streams aligning my cheeks. I'm going to miss you so much, Granddad.
Aye, but we had some good times. Amazing times, didn't we? I sure as hell did. And well, this is a pretty badass way to go out, right?
An unfamiliar comfort swelled up inside me, almost breaking through the tears. Yeah.
Alright, I'm here. The smudge. No idea what I'll find through there.
I could hear the thundering beast across the call as it gained on him. Its clicks and rattles, too.
I'm going in. Promise me one thing, though.
Anything, Granddad.
You be a good kid and make my daughter proud. That's all.
A bizarre noise came from the phone speaker, something akin to the sound of a stone sliding across a frozen lake, followed by a splash that seemed to kill all the noise. That dead silence was broken when a shuddering voice spoke again through the phone.
What the?
Where are you? I yelled, pleading for any small morsel of information that he could provide.
I don't know, I'm in a pipe, I think. Some kind of glass tube. I can see everything outside, it's all there all at once. There's more of these tubes, so many more. They're branching and splitting, but...
The connection got progressively weaker as he talked, jittering and buzzing in my ears.
I'm heading down this tube now and there's central one, but it's huge, enormous. No, I don't think it's the central. In the distance, there's so many. What is this place?
My exhausted brain couldn't fathom a single thing to say. I just listened, almost as confused as he was.
The streams through some of them, and
He was cut off by a tremendous splash, but the sound quality at this point made it sound more like a roar. I could only hear his whimpers until that hissing trill crawled its way under my skin once more. It melded with the audio glitches, but then I heard something that I never could have expected, even after seeing what I had seen. It sounded as if the creature was stuttering, clearing its throat before. It spoke. The unearthly nightmare beast had spoken. Its words were jarring like it was repeating after someone teaching it how to talk, broken by animalistic clicks and hisses. Grandpa screamed, but the call lost connection completely and it drew out as a high sine wave tone. My hand acted on its own accord and loosened its grip, sending the phone clattering to the floor. By the time that I had crouched down to grab it, only my home screen greeted me as I pressed the home button. Call failed. I looked down to Martin and he was out cold but breathing. The bleeding had died down, but he needed urgent treatment. Even so, I fell to the floor, back slouched up against the cold concrete wall, and decided to wait it out until sunrise. I was certain that Grandpa's plan worked, but just the slightest uncertainty held me in place. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off. My limbs ached, head thumping. I fought against my eyelids, but they felt as if dragged down by anchors. All light vanished, and I faded into sleep. I awoke to heat on my face and a red-orange blur. I opened my eyes, grimacing at the rays of sunlight that poured through the destroyed basement hatch directly onto my face. Any notions of a simple nightmare were shattered. Martin. I rolled over on my side, seeing him laying a few feet away. Thank God he was still breathing. The blood coating the skin on his left leg was dried and crusted, but a small amount of it still seeped from his mangled limb. I chose to let him rest while I turned to the broken ladder, hauling myself up what remained of its rungs and out into the house. What remained of it, at least. Utter devastation. I do not exaggerate when I say that almost the entire front portion of the house was gone. Wooden beams jutted out from piles of rubble and dust, but all was still. Unlike the day prior, birdsong weaved throughout the woods and into the ruins. I recall learning about how forest animals would go quiet when a predator is nearby, but I had been too on edge to notice until their sounds had returned. Still, subtle chills wormed their way up my spine. I felt safe, but I had also felt safe with Grandpa in the basement, until the attack. No smoke plumed from anywhere across the tree line, and no stench defiled my nose, but I couldn't shake it. I spent some time scrabbling around in the back half of the house that still stood. And quicker than expected, I found the keys to Grandpa's truck in the corner of the kitchen counter. I practically leaped down into the old wine cellar and then slowed my pace, gently shaking Martin until he stirred. He was groggy and confused. "Don't worry, man, I'm gonna get you home." I wrapped his left arm over my shoulder, supporting him to the ladder. It was tough getting him out, but I did, and we hobbled through the ruins to the truck. Driving faster than truly necessary, I swerved, slamming on the brakes when the fallen tree trunks came into view almost out of nowhere. The jolt shook Martin and he came to attention from the pain in his leg. I apologized for it, but wasted no more time in getting out and helping Martin down from his seat. The stench of death was stronger in the air, the Wendigo corpse festering nearby. It brought me back to the night before, the raw terror spawning paranoia within me that grew intense over the short walk between the truck and my Jeep. I felt exposed and naked. We made it across the trees and into my Jeep quickly, even with Martin's injury. Still, without any warning signs of the beast, my heart was drumming so hard that I could see my chest pulse. After a messy three-point turn, the wheel slipped, kicking up dust before we shot away down the track. We drove until reaching the small police station, where I flew out of the Jeep and burst through its double doors. Perhaps a rash action in retrospect, but my mind was elsewhere. Before anything else, I had them call an ambulance for my friend, following by reporting a severe animal attack. When I was asked what had attacked us, I spat out, "Cougar." The officer grunted and I laid out the facts. Grandpa was gone, dragged away by our assailant. An ambulance arrived soon thereafter to pick up Martin. The EMTs were visibly surprised by the laceration, but attended to him nonetheless. He had lost a fair bit of blood, but they quickly got him in stable condition at the nearest hospital, where he stayed for the next week. A search party banded together to look for Grandpa, but they found nothing, of course. I was questioned about the state of his house, but I think the trauma welling up in my eyes was the best defense that I could have had. No scorch marks on the rubble to indicate explosives, nothing. It's been a few years since this all happened, and I've made it through the stages of grief in one piece. I would like to say that Grandpa lives on in my memory, but that wouldn't be entirely accurate to say. I can still remember him, our conversations, days out, the smell of his fireplace, all that. But no matter how hard I try, I can't remember what he looked like. That's to say, there's only an imperceptible smudge where he once was in any pictures that I still have. I don't know where he ended up, some massive network of tubes, but I get the distinct impression that his grave lies somewhere else, in another place separate from this world. I'm eternally grateful for his sacrifice, yeah, but I can't help but think that this was only our lives that were saved from the Skorstender. Are there more of them, or is it somehow able to relocate itself? Only my grandpa would have the answers, but yeah. Just in case, if you find yourself out in the wilderness and you see a steady plume of smoke rising from the trees, perhaps even smell the organic stench of digestion, it would be best to call off the occasion entirely. Once it's on to you, well, I only hope you're as lucky as we were on the day that my grandpa died.